The current task of humanity is to recognize, oh my God, we've got everything here at our fingertips. And in the last 20 years, with the advent of free information, never before has everyone on the planet had access to the kind of information we have now. But the task becomes, how do we discern what the true dope is? What's the real information? What is my individual truth? What is the truth? And as you and I have talked about a number of times, this is found by connecting with our souls and asking our souls, is this the real deal? Is this something that I need to pay attention to?
This is Spirit Gem. Today, Paul welcomes back Edmund Knighton. Edmund is one of the leading American scholars on Anthroposophy, encompassing the teachings and insights of Rudolf Steiner, as well as a seasoned clinical psychologist specializing in neuropsychology and family systems. Thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures. The sponsors' special offers and discounts are mentioned in this episode, or you can visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast. Paul and Edmund are discussing the topics of becoming a free thinker and becoming truly human.
Well, welcome everybody. Edmund, as many of you will be aware by now from listening to the podcast, has a very deep knowledge of Rudolf Steiner's teachings, of the teachings of Ra, and has spent a large percentage of his life working as a teacher in the Steiner Waldorf school system, as an administrator and a consultant, and has a lot of experience to share regarding both Steiner's teachings and Ra's teachings, which you might remember from our first podcast together. Edmund, what a great pleasure to have you back. I'm excited for our dialogue today.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Paul, for having me here. I'm delighted to be with you again.
As we begin here, I know you and Jared are running a new group, kind of like you ran your men's group, but this time you're opening it to women as well. You're going to have a bunch of experts. I know you've invited me back. Is Laird Hamilton coming back?
Actually, his better half, Gabby Reese.
Oh, good.
Is
Fantastic.
going to join us.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, because Gabby's such a powerhouse on every level. And you're going to have a whole bunch. How many visiting experts are you guys having?
At least 6, and we're going to do half men and half women this time.
Oh, that's a gorgeous idea. I love that. This podcast will kind of give you a sample of the contents of what you will be able to engage, the kind of concepts that each of the experts will be addressing with regard to being human and being a free thinker. I know for sure Gabby's a free thinker. I can tell you that from a lot of experience, like Laird.
She's a powerhouse.
That's the bull's horns right there.
Amen.
There's 2 horns there, Laird and Gabby. Don't mess with the bull.
That's for sure.
Yeah, well, great, Edmund. Well, so to begin, maybe you can give us an overview of what it means to be human and be a free thinker. I want the listeners to understand you're not just coming at this like an academic. You're so deeply woven into the Steiner education system and Steiner's teachings that it's a lived experience for you. It's not a concept.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that's such a great question. What what is a human being? And I think there are probably 3 ways to initially look at it, which is sort of what is the origin of the human being. So what's our past? What's our present task or set of tasks, and then what's the kind of picture of the future human being? And so for the origin of humanity, from Steiner's perspective, if we look back at the beginnings of how human beings were formed, first of all, he would call us the 10th hierarchy, and he would say that 9 hierarchies have walked in our steps before this, and they're at 9 higher levels now. The angelic level being, in a way, the lowest level, or the one that's closest to ours, which is why we each have our own guardian angel that helps us a heck of a lot. Above those angels, there are archangels and archai and Kyriatides and dynamis and thrones and cherubim and seraphim, and each of those individuals eons ago have been in our shoes, and actually some of them are at a place now where they're able to create with their own being human beings themselves, and so the idea from Steiner is that we are actually created by, like the seven sisters of the Elohim, for example, that we were created. And Steiner has a picture that he always turns things on their heads. And so when he talks about Saturn, he's talking about a spiritual Saturn, a kind of invisible or unseen planet, if you will, behind the planet. And that's where the spiritual germ of human beings was formed. And it was formed out of fire. And so initially we were beings of fire.
Can I quickly interject and ask a question on that? Because
Yeah.
the concept, as I've read a lot of Steiner's hierarchical structures, and I've studied alchemy, and there's always references to planets. And I
Hmm.
think that's a confusing thing for people. Now, I'm going to share from my own experience what I found out, because my way of doing these things is I just go investigate for myself. Like if there's a concept that I'm reading in a book and I find it kind of mysterious or not well expressed or too fuzzy, but I think it might be important, and I do whatever I need to do, from astral travel to talking to my soul or my highest self or myself as a totality, because all of ourselves are connected to the whole. So we all have access to all this information. I'm by no means doing anything anyone else couldn't do if they just simply did the work to center and clear themselves in practice. But what I have found, particularly with remote viewing and astral travel, for example, I've done a fair bit of work on Venus. When I go to Venus, which from a physical perspective is not inhabited by living beings. So people, if I say to people, oh, I've met people on Venus, they look at me like I'm a lunatic. But what I've found is that each of the physical planets, and even definitely the sun, because I've done a lot of work on the sun, has, just like we have an aura, and someone who does not have clairvoyance might look at Edmund, and then if I said, well, in Edmund's aura, I can see such and such, they might look at me and think, like, what the hell are you talking about? I see him standing right there. There's none of this around him. But when I go there, I'm actually traveling in my light body. And what I see is that around each of the planets and even the moon, from my experience in our solar system, there are subtle dimensions. And that some of these planets that once had physical beings, say Mars or Venus, have, shall we say, evolved out of the need of a physical body, and those beings are now living in what I would call an astral dimension, or maybe Steiner might call it etheric, but that's a tricky word for reasons I won't get into right now because there's too many.
He'd call it astral. He'd
Yeah,
call it inner planes, yeah, of astral.
yeah. So I go there, and these people are as real as you and I. They talk to me, they teach me things. And I know I'm not deluding myself because I come back here and I test these things and they work. And I could give a lot of examples, but I don't want to segue into too much of that. But when we're talking about planets and you see the loaded in alchemy, I mean, this is constant in alchemy, and then reference to metals from each of the different planets and gemstones that are linked to them and all that. So when you're talking about these stages of developments, or you're Steiner's referring to any of these given planets, isn't he really talking about the spiritual being, just like we have the concept of Mother Earth or Gaia? And
Hmm.
what's your thoughts on the fact that these planets may be inhabited right now by beings that are not physical but are actually real?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in Saturn's case, there's a spiritual council of 9 that's backed up by a council of 24. When those 9 run into challenges in terms of making decisions on behalf of this particular galaxy, but that's where that council originates from and hails from, really in those so-called rings around the planet itself. So they surround it like a mantle. And those beings are responsible, for example, for saying yes to the creation of human beings on this planet at this time. And they're also responsible for saying yes to things like genetic engineering that needed to take place at a certain time. When you mentioned Mars, for example, there were third density beings on Mars. They could be analogous to what would be called a human being, but they actually made that planet inhospitable. And Creator and the Logos, in its infinite wisdom and kindness, gave those beings a place to inhabit. And that was, or is, Earth. And so many of the beings who are on the Earth right now, who are called human beings, are originally from Mars. And those individuals had to have some genetic engineering in order to be able to have this planet be more habitable to them, because their time sequence was different. They had a 25-hour day instead of 24, for example. But that genetic engineering created a lot of challenges because they were made into almost like a super race. And some individuals on the internet have called this the Anunnaki. Anak, A-N-A-K, is the original name of this species. And what happened is they were given an opportunity to be stronger, to be larger. And the idea is that they would be able to serve Creator and serve others. But everything has its opposite, or its alternate possibility. And so beings of Orion had the opportunity to encourage those individuals to think that they were elite. And their elitism created a kind of enslavement on the planet for a period of time until they went into a diaspora and found some more humility around being human. But that's part of what the question of being human, it gets into complexity when you get into the Earth, because there are native human beings who have come from this planet all the way through first, second, to into third density. But then there are beings from other planets, like Mars, for example, or like Maldek, some of whom actually became and still are Bigfoot, holding in reserve in case there's some kind of nuclear catastrophe. They have a resistance to radioactivity. Then there are beings from all around the galaxy who needed a place to inhabit. And so Earth is a kind of a mutt, if you will. And it's somewhat unique in that way. And it makes the difficulty of harvesting or graduating as one unity much more challenging. As you can see, the kind of nation states and the kind of bellicosity that happens around the planet. And if we just recognize that we are from many different places, it's America is kind of a picture in miniature of that. And Steiner gave America as the picture of the future of humanity, kind of a signpost for us as a result of that, because it's the melting pot of so many different groups of individuals. It's like a nation snapshot of what the Earth as a whole has been for the last many hundreds of thousands of years, of these entities coming together, but still being somewhat isolated on the planet in their own nation states or fiefdoms, if you will. And so you see that the sort of Martian tendency in toward fighting is a first response or defensiveness for many individuals. But we're all given another opportunity to move through that and to find our service to others, which is really the goal of being a human being. Is, are we going to serve Creator by serving ourselves or serving others? In terms of the Creator, it really doesn't matter which one you serve. You have to serve Creator. It's not possible not to. But the way to do it is to make a decision and stick to that decision, to have some discipline, just like a workout. The workout for some is to serve others 51% of the time. The workout for others is to serve themselves 95% of the time. And this gets into a little bit of the future aspect of humanity, which is, if you're able to do that, then you move into a density of awareness where you get to be like these other hierarchies who walked ahead of us, who can serve the individuals like ourselves right now. And the way that you serve is by actually going through disease and death and pain and illness and all of the worst atrocities that you can imagine. Most of us on this planet call it trauma. That's the big buzzword. But really all it is experience. You can turn it into trauma if you want. But if you have understanding around it, then it's no longer traumatic. It's actually integrated into the self as power, as a gift. And the more experience you have of all of those challenges, the more capable we will be in the next density following this, in the future humanity that we have, to serve those in whose footsteps we've just walked. And that is the main goal of what it means right now to be human, is to understand the illusion of death, for example, to understand evil, and to transform it after understanding is the next level. So for Steiner, he has these huge epochs of what our main task is. And the last task that we had was to understand the illusion of death. And so when he came into incarnation in this lifetime, he clearly he made all sorts of what would it be called? I think it would be called syncretic. It would be called a kind of a synesthetic connection of all of the religions, all of the mystery schools, all of the philosophies. And a lot of people thought he was oversimplifying or overreaching or appropriating. I understand the argument on one hand, but if you look at what he did with that, Paul, it's exactly what you just talked about, that he took it upon himself to figure these things out for himself and then to put it into the world in his own kind of spirit gym, his own kind of dreamline. And he gave us the capacity for self-initiation for the first time on the planet. And that's the current task of humanity, is to recognize, oh my God, we've got everything here at our fingertips. And in the last 20 years, with the advent of free information, never before has everyone on the planet had access to the kind of information we have now. But the task becomes, how do we discern what the true dope is? What's the real information? What is my individual truth? What is the truth? And as you and I have talked about a number of times, this is found by connecting with our souls and asking our souls, is this the real deal? Is this something that I need to pay attention to? And Steiner parsed out 3 different sections of soul, if you will, from age 21 to 42, which is the primary adult life. And the first part of soul from 21 to 28 is the sentient soul, where you feel the truth. You feel what's right. And you're not necessarily able to articulate it very, very distinctly, but you know what's right and what feels right. And that's this aspect of the soul that first develops. It's a little bit sleepier, and it's at that 21 to 28. From 28 to 35, that soul shifts into a kind of an intellectual or a mind soul, a rational or analytical soul, where you can ever so clearly think the truth. And the challenge is that the feeling life gets sort of left behind, because it's like giving a kid a set of car keys, because when the intellect comes online and inserts itself in the soul, it's very exciting. And so that 28 to 35 intellectual soul time, you sharpen to a razor's edge your capacity for thought, but it's separated somewhat from your thinking. And then when you reach the 35 mark, which Jung and Steiner and Gurdjieff and so many spiritual teachers talked about, don't begin spiritual teaching until you reach the 35 mark, the bottom of the bowl. Because now you're combining in what Steiner called a consciousness soul, you're combining the feeling soul with the thinking soul. And you're creating what he called a heart thinking, which is a whole body or living thinking, where you're completely embodied. And you're weaving together the feeling that you had of what's right with the knowing that you had of what's right. And for Steiner, that weaving together of the rational and the intuitional is the task for humanity now. And we all get to do it on our own. We don't need a hierophant. We don't need a guru. And we don't actually need a spiritual path, he said, to do it. We can use basic common sense, which is pretty amazing. You can read spiritual knowledge and your soul tells you this is correct. Keep going on this path. And that's what I've always loved about you, is you're the self-made soul teacher. And this is what Steiner really, really brought to us 100 years ago, is this capacity is present right now in all of us. And all we have to do is turn off the television.
Well, guess what? Drew Canoli is sitting here right here with me, and I'm going to try to sell him on Organifi's green juice. Drew, you got to try this stuff. My kids love it. I love it. And for a lot of people that are too busy to get good shop and find, proper organic greens, it's the way to go. It's fast, it's easy, and it tastes good.
Yep.
But since you made it, why don't you tell everyone else about it?
Yeah. So one of the things that Organifi strives for is transparency in labels.
That's a good idea.
We almost have 4 grams of the greens, organic greens, and then 3 grams of the superfood blend. Not to mention 600 milligrams of ashwagandha.
Yes.
300 milligrams is the clinical dose for lowering stress. And when we're not stressed out, we don't crave food. Right,
you don't crave junk.
You don't crave junk.
Yeah.
And because you don't crave junk, it actually helps support weight loss.
Yeah.
So naturally, and this is the first green juice that was, with the ashwagandha in it, and now it's glyphosate residue free. It's amazing.
You know what I like about this and all of your juice mixes of this style? 1, they taste good. 2, I can get up out of my chair and in 32 seconds, I can have something that tastes good and feels good in my body and actually contributes to my mental stability and my ability to get work done, or to my weightlifting, or to my overall physiological adaptation to the stress of life.
Yeah, when we're stressed out, we don't produce testosterone as men.
Yes.
As much.
Shuts it way down.
So the ashwagandha helps with that. And one of my favorite mentors told me that it's a bioharmonizer.
It's a bioharmonizer for sure. We don't do biohacking around here. And that's why I love your products, because they are bioharmonizers. And that's what we all need, right?
So, absolutely.
Thank you to Organifi and you for making such great products. I really love sharing them on my podcast, and my kids and my family use them daily. So this is the real deal. So if you want to get your green juice, you can go to Organifi, ORGANIFI.com/CHEK20. And on checkout, use the code CHEK20. You get 20% off, and that's a damn good
family
deal.
Discount.
And your whole family will be the better for it. And you will enjoy the taste and feel good and know that you're doing something that your doctor won't do for you.
Absolutely.
Aho, great spirit.
Aho.
Aho. Thanks, buddy. The sentient soul, I really feel, communicates to us through what we would call gut feelings. You know, like we have this sense of what is the right direction to go if we're maybe lost in the forest. We feel it in our body. It's an instinct, a gut feeling. You know, like a detective will say, I have a gut feeling that so-and-so is such and such. And you know, typically they're, you know, a lot of these, you know, metaphorical detectives are not very spiritually evolved, but they're very good hunters. You know, soldiers often follow their gut instinct because it keeps them alive. And so then the intellect is really quite a complicated process, because depending on how you accumulate knowledge through intellect and use your mind, it has a real tendency to obstruct your trust in your gut feelings. And so it's interesting because what you've shared is very much in parallel with Gene Gebser's structure stages of consciousness that I've talked about on many podcasts.
The consciousness soul would be Gebser or Wilber's notion of integral consciousness.
Right. So that would be after the intellectual soul.
It would be.
Yeah.
Yes.
And because that's the integration of all these faculties, abilities. To be conscious is not the same thing as being smart or intelligent.
It's often opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. You can be really smart and build nuclear weapons. You can be really smart and put the ingredients together for a great chemtrail. You can be really smart and make very destructive vaccines and claim that you're helping people. But, you know, this is head without heart, and it's extremely dangerous. So, you know, there's something I read in a book on mythology, and I can't remember the author's name, and I've quoted it several times because it's so profound. And he said, only the heart can deliver justice to the head. And I think that oftentimes we have to go through these undulations of trial and error and pain in our lives and heartbreak and falling in love and then falling out of love and all the trials of human life that you were alluding to earlier. You know, Rumi says the function of a broken heart is to let your love pour out. And that's kind of counterintuitive, but it all depends on healing. And I think, you know, like you mentioned, trauma is a buzzword these days. Unfortunately, there's just a plethora of approaches to healing out there now. I mean, I think if anyone gravitates toward almost any of them, they're going to get something positive. But one of the challenges, I think, of truly being human is that if we don't do the work to get honest within ourselves, what love really means to us and how are we going to live that? How valuable are our relationships? How important is the truth to us as a human being? Then what happens is we, through our intellectual developmental state, we get all these ideas and we get polarized. And so what happens is we can end up like someone caught in a religion fighting another religion and going to war, believing that what we're doing is what God wants. Yet in every war, people on both sides always think they're doing what God wants. And so what I'm leading toward here is that if there's not some level of an honest attempt to heal, to do shadow work, to ask, you know, Steiner's question that stuck in my mind is when the awareness soul comes on, you will begin asking yourself, is it really true, when you're confronted with so-called truths or facts that don't sit well with you. And I tell my students all the time that whenever you have two diametrically opposed viewpoints by experts of equal qualification, it's a gift to you to say, quit reading books and listening to other people and do the work to find out what's true for you.
Yeah.
And so I think if we don't have the adult maturity to tune our truth compass through going through our own stock of beliefs, ideas, behaviors, concepts, and hold that up to the flame of, I would say, love or of higher consciousness. But I think love is the safest word, because higher consciousness can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I think we all have a sense of what love means. Then what we can end up doing is we can be quite intelligent sounding, we can be quite successful, we can be quite even viewed by others as a guru type, but really actually have our compass oriented in a direction that may actually lead to a lot of polarity and division, not only within ourselves, but within the people that we have influence upon. So I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let me go back to the first thing you mentioned, sort of the soldiering instinct that's in all of us, and almost the reflexive action that we don't have to think about. The picture that Steiner offers in there is, let's say you're a 21-year-old and you are trying to suss out what is my spiritual truth, and I do feel my way into it. This comes from both Steiner and Ra, that as you look at your basic energy centers, the instinct level of will is at here, I just put this down a little bit, is at your base chakra. And that's where safety and survival and sexuality are. And so that's one way to use that chakra, that energy center, as a lens for whether this is truth for the soul. The second level would be the power center, the right use of power. And so this is making sure that in relationship, I never try to possess anyone or be possessed by them. And I'm exercising the right use of power, which means I'm always looking for what's the best way for me to use what Ra would call, you use the word love, and I love that you say, I think we all know what we mean by that. Ra has a wonderful way of describing love as intelligent energy.
Mm-hmm.
And intelligent, not like intellect. That would be the opposite of love. That would be isolation and separatism and the left-hand negative path. But that's that second chakra. The third is around society and the emotional body. So it's using emotions to try to feel our way into the truth. Emotion as energy in motion. And then your picture of healing would be at the heart center, where love is the gateway to figuring out healing. And then healing is the gateway to manifestation. So there's this threefold process through the heart center to actually embody something, starting with love, moving into healing the shadow, just as you said, and then moving into manifestation. And then the fifth center would be absolutely honest communication, so transparent to the point of whatever it is that I'm thinking or feeling, I'm able to express that, and it's able to be held by all those around me. That's a real preparation for where human beings are going, because we're not going to be needing language like we're doing right now. We'll just be able to communicate with each other directly. And what that will also mean, though, is that as soon as I think something or feel something, you'll know exactly what it is that I'm thinking or feeling. And I'm going to have to work with that. And you are too. And so cleaning up our act right now, being very clear in our speech, very clear in our thinking. Steiner was clear, and Ra as well, that a thought is a form that actually comes at the other person, just as speech comes at another person. And we have to be conscious when we're using those thoughts that they are more powerful in a certain way than the actions that we do. And so as that 21-year-old, you have all of those different options to suss out what is real for you, for all the way from instinct and then up through these areas here. Each one of them represents a different level of will development, starting from instinct at the energy center 1 or chakra 1. Then in the gut, that power center is around impulse and drive and ambition. And then in the third energy center, it's around desires in the solar plexus. In the fourth, it's around motive. In the fifth center, it's around wish. In the sixth center, it's around intention. And the seventh is resolve. And so we're kind of sandwiched by resolve and by instinct, the highest and lowest energy centers. And in between is where all the action happens, all the free will. What Ra calls the law of free will, which is the first distortion, is also called the law of confusion, because you can see how complex the soul has to be in order to work with all of these different energy centers, each one individually, but then each one talks to each other. Just as you talk to all those Venus beings, they happen to be all aligned in their thinking and their willing. And so thank God for that, because sussing out what it would be like. I mean, Ra himself, he was the group of entities that inhabited Venus and left Venus after they developed. They lived a third density experience on that planet many eons ago. And now he's in a different configuration. As you said, once he's not embodied, he can walk the universe with unfettered tread. So there's no limitation on his capacity to reach in consciousness anywhere he needs to go. But the amazing thing is that's true for us right now, because we're only thinking we're living in time and space. And this is what Steiner and Ra tried to convey to us at every moment, is we're not. We're not in time and space, and we're not embodied. The true essence of who and what we are lives outside of that in all dimensions contemporaneously. And we have little glimpses of that. And if we're able to integrate those glimpses without losing our sanity, then we have the capacity to do amazing growth. And so that soul progression that you were inviting is the heart of the life from 21 to 42. But there are 3 bodies that get developed from 0 to 7 and 7 to 14 and 14 to 21 that lead us into that soul being equipped to make those decisions based on the balancing of those energy centers. So for the high schooler, you mentioned planets, for example. The high schooler has a kind of thinking that's a feeling thinking. It's not an intellectual thinking. It's very much based on mood, and it's based on soul mood or planet mood. And there are 7 primary distinctions that Waldorf teachers use to work with that particular quality of thinking that a high schooler brings. And each of those soul moods then moves into being exercised when that individual turns 21, and that body gets freed to work on those 7 different soul moods, with the goal being, how do I integrate those into an octave, if you will, into a harmony of the spheres, so that I'm balanced in my soul thinking. Because when I get to the intellectual soul, if I have that level of balance already established, and this is what all of Waldorf education aims toward, is that I can come into the rational soul and I can bring warmth and life to it at all times. It doesn't isolate me from the world. It makes me incredibly capable in the world.
Yeah, it's all very profound. I mean, one of the challenges with Steiner, even Ra and various others, but particularly in this context, Steiner, is that there's so many other indoctrinated systems out there and beliefs that go counter current to Steiner's teachings. And that brings up a note that I wrote down while you were talking earlier. I didn't want to interrupt you because I wanted to give you the chance to really express yourself. But we were talking about, the fact you were mentioning the fact that now we can actually become free on our own. And so the question I wrote down is I'm assuming that what you mean by on our own is that we no longer are so likely to be bound in institutionalized thinking, such as organized religion or having to be part of a dogma. Because of the way the world is today, it's not unusual for people like me or you or anybody to basically develop their own living philosophy and maybe explore Buddhism and bring some Buddhist concepts into your life and some maybe some Christian concepts and some Taoist concepts and some rational scientific thinking. Is that what you're really talking about when you're talking about we have the ability to become free human beings ourselves versus?
That's a great question. I really appreciate you parsing that. And so on our own means not on our own at all in a certain way, because from a higher level, it's on our own because the law is one and all is one. But in the third dimension or density where we are right now, it's very clear that on our own has to mean that we're in contact with our guides. And so there's in Ra's picture, there's a male and female guide, and then there's a neutral or original human being guide, just as the original human being was created both male and female in one body. And then there's an angel that stands behind us. And then there's a higher self, which comes actually from a sixth density future. And then you used the word totality earlier. There's a totality that comes from a seventh density that feeds the higher self, that feeds the angel, that feeds the human being. And so when I say on our own, what I mean is in conscious contact with that whole entelechy of the self. That's the guide. That on our own, just by ourselves, we could be dilettantes. We could lack discipline and choose a little bit from here and a little bit from there. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as we have the discipline, once we've chosen those things, to really bring them together and work in a solid way to develop our own practice that serves humanity. And the challenge is that there's so much out there. It's like eye candy. It's like it's spiritual materialism then, where we take a little bit of this, but then that practice gets boring. And what we used to have, and what Buddhism still has, is very, very simple, repetitive sayings that you have to bring your own new life to every time you say them. And if you don't do that, then the practice dies. So on our own, that's what that means, is that when we're with children, we have dinner with them every night with no screens. We say a prayer to Creator every night, and they feel our love and our honor. We have a bedtime ritual for them, and they have the same chore every day of the year. These are things that are incredibly strengthening. And so this is what we want when we're talking about on our own, is our connection to all of these higher realms of ourselves that we know exist and that we're actively working with. We've never had that capacity before. We always had to have some kind of intercessory, and now we have the capacity to do it on our own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But maybe you could describe what an intercessory would have been like, so we can have a context of something like a tangible reference point to say this is how it was, but now this is what we can do on our own.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Mexican mysteries. There's there would be the Egyptian mysteries, the Druid mysteries. All of these things involved usually 3.3 days of a kind of a death process in order for the self to come to quietness, to the extent that it could overcome fear of death of the body, and sometimes even a fear of the death of the self, which we know is an illusion, but you get to meet that wall. And a Hierophant, a guide, would be the one who watches over that process to make sure that you actually don't physically die, that they're able to see, as you said, the aura, the finer bodies. They're able to watch the process of integration, but they wouldn't have guided the initiate, the student, into that process in the first place if they didn't see the readiness of that. And so that individual is the one who watches the finer body process, who sees that the individual is ripe for transformation, and then that process commences under their guidance. Now we're able to do that ourselves, and we have to be really careful around this. I know, for example, that there's been a huge increase in plant medicine use over the past not so long, and certainly it's come into the mainstream. And so the gift there is the opening of the doors of perception. The challenge can be that, again, aura has, it's not the right term, but can have leaks or holes or cracks as a result of that incredible infusion of vital energy that the self uses and uses up in order to gain that experience for itself. And if we're not careful, then entities or the feelings and thoughts of entities can come toward us into that auric field that's usually completely protected, and or we can have our own self and soul sort of leaking out energetically, our vitality. So if we're not capable of seeing or sensing or feeling that in ourselves, we need to make sure that currently we're with a guide who can see or sense, and that we're willing to follow that advice. Otherwise, the other practice that I would highly recommend would be talking to the medicine, because all of medicine is a being. And for Steiner, every concept, every idea is actually a being. And once you draw yourself down into, say, deeply underwater with that idea, the spirit of tobacco, the spirit of ayahuasca, the spirit of alcohol, these are all beings to have a conversation with and to say, is this medicine right for me? And under what circumstances do I take it, and how much, and who do I take it with? And what's the spiritual intention that I set? Because we know that the set and setting are really essential. These are all the kinds of very disciplined preparation and purification practices that anything that we do spiritually really will benefit us to have that as before we get started on that journey.
January is here. Can you believe it? How are you doing with your New Year's resolutions? If you're like most people, me included, you start the year with great goals to exercise more, eat better, get to bed earlier, start a work-in practice or meditate daily, study some personal improvement book or course regularly, and just become a healthier, happier, more evolved human being. But if you're also like most people, within a few short weeks, life gets in the way and all those good intentions slip away and just seem too hard to accomplish. This is why you need a community to support you and a coach to guide and encourage you. And now you can get both of those when you join the Spirit Gym community. In fact, research shows that people have a 65% chance of reaching a goal if they have an accountability partner. And you can get the support of an entire community of accountability partners when you join Spirit Gym. Now through January 15th, Spirit Gym has special incentives, discounts, and a brand new level of membership to help you make 2025 a standout year. This is the best time for you to join and turn confusion into clarity, uncertainty into purpose, and unfulfillment into true freedom. Go to myspiritgym.com today to get the full details. Whether you opt for the full membership with access to Paul's Master Key online course plus the community, or you decide to join just the community with access to the weekly calls with Paul and his select guests, which are called Sanghas in Spirit Gym, there is a membership option that is right for you. So visit myspiritgym.com and join the growing group of people who are transforming their lives and adopting new freedoms that bring joy, wholeness, and fulfillment.
For those listening, I've done a very comprehensive 4-hour podcast with a very skilled shaman, Hamilton Souther, called Plant Medicine Essentials, where I get very deep with Hamilton into everything you need to be aware of, what the risks are, what the benefits are, how to analyze if it's safe to do it with someone, what kind of challenges you might face, what ways you can stabilize yourself. It's a very complete, and I did it because so many people are getting injured with plant medicines, and they come to me from all over the world with a lot of problems. And, I have a lot of experience with plant medicines simply because my soul called me to it, and because it was important for me based on the early experiences that I had, where I had profound union experiences with God and healing experiences, such as getting over the deep, deep pain of the loss of my brother to suicide. I realized how the effective use of plant medicines could do probably more for people in as little as one ceremony to a couple of years of skilled use than most people get out of 10 to 20 years sitting on a psychologist's couch. But I had to study and master them so that I could use these things, shall we say, skillfully and almost surgically, as opposed to just diving into the river and hoping the alligators don't get you,
Yeah.
There's a lot. Someday it would be nice maybe if you and I and maybe even Hamilton Souther or others have a dialogue on the spiritual aspects of plant medicines and sort of the benefits and the drawbacks of them, because I think that area hasn't been explored by people that have enough depth on both in experience of them, but also in spiritual development, to really have an educated dialogue. You just get a lot of opinion tossing going on out there. And it only takes me about 5 seconds listening to someone to know, whether or not they're skilled or not. A good example of exactly what I'm talking about. I'm reading a very good book right now called The Self and Jungian Psychology by Leslie Stein. And it's a very, very deep, thorough book, probably 450 something pages long. And I'm 3/4 of the way through it. But he's quoting all sorts of people that were contradictory to Jung, or that had opposing opinions from within his own camp as to the self. And all throughout the book, I've left notes for people. And it's just dead clear to me, as a guy who's spent a lot of time in deep communication with my soul, my highest self, or the self, that these people are making arguments that are purely and utterly intellectual and are not coming from a relationship with their own self. And it's shocking to me that we have so many books written by so many experts that have almost no legitimate spiritual depth to them, even when they're being promoted as, or even promote themselves as, so-called experts in these fields. And I think that's one of the booby traps that we have in the world, with all this flooding of information, and also because the academic system that we've so embodied in our culture puts people in the position of being experts based on a degree, but that doesn't mean that you actually are an expert at anything.
Often the reverse.
Yeah. And so what happens is people go out looking for good information, and their benchmark is, does this guy have a master's degree or a PhD? And, there's been many places where I would love to have been able to get invited to, give a presentation or whatever, but because I don't have a degree, they won't even consider me. And so these are very, very complicated waters to wade through. All of it. It's which is why this podcast is so important to me. I mean, not just this podcast right now, but my podcast, because I really do my very best to share what I've learned through a life of committed practice and study, to kind of try to bring some semblance of rationality, open-mindedness to a lot of these dialogues, because there is so much out there. Forever I have students come up to me and say, well, Paul, you say this, but this guy says this, and he's got a PhD, and, blah, and I look at this and I'm like, so what my typical thing that I do is I give students exercise. I go, well, okay, if he or she is saying is true, then you should be able to do this and get this result. So go try it and tell me what happens. And, inevitably they try it and come back and go, well, that didn't work out. And I'm well, of course it didn't, because A squared plus B squared doesn't equal C squared. When you understand these three factors of an equation, which is, to give a good example of this, when I was in electronics school and I had to go to math school to get into electronics school, the instructor had a very good intuitive sense as to whether or not you knew how you got the answer, even if it was correct. And because we had to be trained in a battlefield situation to not depend on calculators or computers, we had to be able to repair the circuits by hand. For a year in electronics school, we had to do every single circuit load, circuit equation, all by hand. And so what would happen is the instructor would, and it's happened to me several times, which I really hated, because I'm not naturally gifted and talented at math. I had to work my brain till it fried every day. But I would get the right answer quite often, but I didn't really know how I got the right answer. So why I'm bringing this up is because you can memorize a formula like Pythagorean's theorem, a squared plus b squared is c squared, and many others, but that doesn't mean you actually understand how it works. So the instructor would come to me and he would say, now take me through every step you went through to get to this answer and tell me what's happening at each step. And so what would happen is I realized later that I was actually just, shall we say, letting my soul answer the questions. I was doing it intuitively, and I would go through the right procedures, but I could not explain exactly what was happening at each step. And so, unfortunately, oftentimes I would lose 10 points on an exam because there would be 10 questions that I could not give them step by step, even though I had the correct answer. And so why I'm making this sort of expose of this is because there's a lot of people that can give you the answer that might sound correct, and it might actually be correct from a verbal perspective, but they don't understand how they got from point A to point B. And if you're doing plant medicines and you don't understand what's going to happen from point A to point B and what to do when A squared and B squared meet, you might not get C squared. And you can be very confused by that. For example, if I microdose with mushrooms, then I'm going to heal and everything's going to be colorful and I'm going to feel great. Or if I microdose with LSD, I'm going to be a real genius. But you may not get that result at all. And that can be a problem. So anyhow, these are just some of the things that I think are important for people to kind of digest and really be aware of because of the quagmire of information we have. Information can be as destructive as it is helpful, as you know.
Yeah, and I would welcome a conversation with that plant medicine topic, and particularly the spiritual components of it, because just as you said, there is very much this Pollyanna, and again, it's a materialistic viewpoint that something external to me is going to help me. Actually, it's all it is a reflection of remembering who you are. That's all medicine is. And knowing that there are also beings who will test you all along the way is really essential. You did this piece around Lucifer and Ahriman. Lucifer lives in our feeling body. Ahriman lives in our habit life. But there are also two other beings. There's the Soratic beings and there's the Azuric beings. The Azuric beings were brought in through vaccination. They weren't even home to this planet at that point. But those Azuric beings were able to attack the physical body and prevent spirit and soul from entering in as a result of certain neurotoxin injections. On the other hand, in the I being or the ego being, the soratic beings are incredibly clever. All of these beings are clever, and all of them tell you exactly what you want to hear. And when you're under the influence of substances, then we all know you're much more highly suggestible. You're open. You're an open book. And so knowing that those beings are there and that consciousness on your part is needed, not only in preparation, but during that journey to recognize when that being, and it's none of them are external beings. They all live in us. And this is the shadow work that if we haven't done that before we do some kind of incredible journey, we may find out that we've regressed rather than moved forward. And to your intellectual comment around, he's got a PhD, Paul, so you obviously need to get a little more studied up. The idea of intellect, Steiner brought a very interesting idea. He said when children come into the classroom and they're 7 years old and they're ready to learn, if you bring anything to them that's abstract, that's theoretical, that's intellectual, you're speaking to a part of themselves that they've already lived through prenatally. In other words, before birth, that's all they come in, and they have already had all of those experiences, because anything that comes out of that realm is death. It's something that's already occurred in the past. If you want to teach children, then become present to them, be embodied with them, work artistically with them, paint and sculpt and do metal work, do movement with them, work rhythmically with them. And the meaningful movement is most important, not just calisthenic movement, where for some bizarre reason we're thinking that the material body is just off on its own to be worked with. It's always integrated with rhythm and with life and with feeling and with real thinking, which for Steiner, real thinking means that there's a spiritual being. And these beings are called the spirits of personality that move through our thinking and that inspire not only us, but inspire anyone that we're speaking to. It's kind of like when Rumi says, "Who speaks these words with my mouth? Who looks out from the eyes? What is the soul? I can't stop asking." This is the kind of thinking that we're looking for, and it comes from the realm of the heart. And if you look at the Greeks had the blemies, and you'll see it in Etruscan cultures and Ethiopian cultures all around the world. There's this decapitated male and female, and they take their heads off and they place them in front of their hearts. And this is what you said, this beautiful quote that you had. It's reminded me of the blemies, where the idea is that John was a picture of this when he was beheaded, for example, that the intellect is this picture of the head, which is of the past. It's the corpse of thinking. It's not actual thinking. And to bring it alive, you remove it, sever it, and you place it in service of the heart. And that heart thinking is the future of humanity. That's what's going to save us, is being able to place the head in service to the heart.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. There's something I wrote down earlier when you were talking. If the truth of ourselves lives in the eternal now, and I know that it does from my own experiences, and God is eternal and God is infinite, then how do we transfer from that reality to epochs? Because now we're actually, the only way we can really do that is to say that time is inherent to a process that can be only described as an illusion.
Yeah, time is inherent to a process that can only be described as an illusion from this perspective in time space, or space time space. Whereas outside of our three-dimensional space time configuration, we're in timelessness. in the last 100 years, physicists have looked at the conception of time, and I think there was an article starting in the 1930s with the reappearance of Christ in the etheric. Of course, it makes sense because the etheric is all about information and a conception of what actually are the parameters we're existing in. Individuals from the realm of physics started to realize that not only is there no time, but there are possibilities of negative time, and even worked it out mathematically. That first article didn't get a whole lot of press. It sort of got left unseen for at least a couple of decades. But since that time, a number of individuals have really seen that the construct of time and the construct of space are endemic to our experience right now. And our experience is this big from Ra and Steiner's perspective. Ra, particularly, it's three 25,000-year periods, or close to a Platonic year, where the sun moves through its cycle. And that level of experience, we're going to be ensconced in space and time. We're going to be veiled from the reality that we knew beforehand as second density beings, as first density beings, crystalline beings, and all of the densities that are after this. And what that provides for us is the capacity to polarize toward evolution of the self and of the species at a rate that would be 1,000 times more. The catalyst is 1,000 times more intense. Catalyst being what Ra would call experience or trauma, depending on
distortion. He refers to it as distortion a lot.
Yes, as distortion. And so that catalyst is programmed by ourselves. As Jung would say, of course, in the unconsciousness, it comes up, it arises spontaneously. We don't get to look at our cards until we're dealt them right in the moment, and then we're in vivo. We've got to decide what to do right there in that moment. And because we're shielded from the umbilical cord of the creator, we have this capacity in a very short span of lifetime, which is maybe 90 years. If you compare that 90-year period that we have in order to grow, our capacity to polarize towards service to self or others is 1,000 times more intense than it is once we're outside of this realm, because we recognize creator, we recognize our connection, that we're not isolated, that we're not separated. This division that we had into two sexes, we're consciously moving back ourselves. That's part of what initiation is, from a single sexed so-called being back to a two-spirited person. And when you look at Steiner's picture of these grand epochs, the Lemurian epoch is where human beings were in harmony with the earth. We were much softer in our bodies, and our will capacity was incredibly powerful. We could leap huge distances, and we didn't choose to manipulate plants or the environment outside of ourselves. We always chose to manipulate, if you will, or work with our inner selves. And all of those beings who moved from that Lemurian catastrophe, which was actually just a natural catastrophe, it was not human-made, moved out into places all over the earth. And these are our brothers and sisters we call the Indians. And it's very clear that these cultures understand the value of a two-spirited person. A two-spirited person in that culture is able to come and go across the threshold at any time. They're the shamans. They're the ones who are looked to. And it's our right, our privilege, and hopefully our responsibility to consciously move back toward that two-spirited person that we were when we were originally created. When we were divided into male and female, then it's very easy to have our thinking be living in duality. And that's the challenge of the third density, is to believe that we're separate from other people, when actually the ones that we dislike the most are the ones that we're probably most alike. And Steiner says the people that you hate the most or that you fear the most are the ones that you spend the most time with when you go to sleep every night. As soon as you drop out of your body, you go and seek those individuals. Now, why is that? Because this is the capacity to polarize towards service to others the most in this density. When we move into fourth density, we're not going to make it to 90 years for a lifetime. One single lifespan, according to Ra, is 90,000 years. Just imagine that, from 90 years to 90,000.
Hi, everybody. I know that you're all aware of the importance of vitamin C. There is a mountain of research on it, but not all C is created equally. I love Paleo Valley's Essential C Complex because it is the real deal, bioavailable, and I wanted you to hear right from Autumn Smith, founder of Paleo Valley, why their Essential C complex is so unique and something you definitely want for your family and your children. Autumn, tell us about your Essential C complex.
Well, I was shocked to learn as a holistic nutritionist that 90%, over 90% of the vitamin C on the market is derived from genetically modified corn, and then it's processed with highly volatile acids. And so I knew I had to find a better way to get all of the powerful benefits of vitamin C. So what I did was I dove into the research and I found the three most vitamin C rich superfoods on the planet. That's unripe acerola cherry and camu camu and amla berry. And then I just packed them into capsules. And the benefits are amazing because you're not only getting vitamin C, but all of the other wonderful benefits that come from these amazing superfoods. So to get access to this complex, all you have to do is go to paleovalley.com and you can use the code CHEK15 at checkout. That's lowercase CHEK 15, and you can save 15% off.
In classic physics, fourth density is time. What is it in this model you're using? Because that's not time that you're talking about.
Actually, yeah, it is. It's time space, and so the time space is the reverse of the space time third density, and so the time space reality, and this is where it gets difficult to talk about how long is a lifespan, but there still is a component of time there. It's just that we're not in a three-dimensional configuration anymore. As you said, we don't have to be visible as beings. We're what Ra would call the unmanifested being or the unpotentiated being. We're still in potentiation, and we can move into and out of embodiment or manifestation at will. So that's what the fourth density is. One where when I think, all of us think. When I feel, all of us feel. When I act, all of us act. And we're harmonizing that on a scale of thousands and millions in order to then go off that fourth density planet, and Earth will be fourth density according to Ra and Steiner. We move out of that in order to service individuals on other third density planets who are capable of this kind of life where life is veiled and it's not clear whether there's a creator or not. And there are 18,090,000 planets just in this galaxy that are capable of supporting that third density life. That's a lot of capacity for service.
Yeah. Now, just to help listeners as well, I will give another angle on time space because it's a lot more familiar to us than people realize. They just don't know how to make the connection. In space time, if you're driving from your house to work, and let's say it takes 20 minutes to get there at the typical flow of traffic. So you say, yeah, usually it takes me 20 minutes to get to work. While you're driving to work, you're very likely to have periods where all of a sudden you're doing what we might call daydreaming. And in the daydream, you're thinking about maybe what you're going to make for dinner tonight. You're thinking about what promotion you hope to get at work this year. You could actually metaphorically live an entire lifetime in 3 or 4 minutes of a daydream, while at the same time, your body's driving down the road in the car and somehow remembering to step on the brake pedal at a red light. And you can even go through intersections and all of a sudden look in the rearview mirror and go, oh my God, I don't remember if the light was green or not, because you were in time space working in that time space dimension, which does not have the physical constraints that space time does.
Yeah. Another way that Steiner would bring to this is the difference between Euclidean geometry and synthetic or projective geometry. It's Dewey Larson's physics. If you want to look into it from a physics perspective, he very clearly and helpfully distinguishes between space-time and time-space. But for Steiner, that distinction is that Euclidean space works only for 1,000,000 miles, and that's where the theory of relativity breaks down. The human being is actually formed from time-space, from the periphery to the point. And so another way to say it would be the difference between centrifugal and centripetal forces. And we're constantly being formed by what's moving toward us, particularly toward our limbs, toward our hands and feet. And that's why we have this kind of suction feeling that's outward in the palms and in the soles of the feet. It's coming towards us and streams toward us. And for Steiner, this arm is actually just a little tiny stump of what our real arm is. The real arm is infinite, extends from infinite space toward us all the time and streams through us. And so getting a conception of what is a human being from a time-space perspective is that this rays into us and that we're actually just rays of light moving toward us, and we're moving toward a process of crystallization, particularly in these 7 primary energy centers. And the more crystallized we are, the more we can reflect and radiate light toward all of creation. That's a time-space perspective, and that's what the etheric or form maker is able to provide for us. And the crystallization of these energy facets, intelligent energy, which you called love earlier, that facet occurs through the balancing of these energy centers with each other, and that occurs through so-called traumatic experience.
So maybe you can elaborate on how traumatic experience has a balancing effect, because that's going to be counterintuitive for a lot of people.
Yeah, so traumatic experience is only seen as trauma when it's not integrated. And the intellect comes into play here to take us out of the natural healing process. The neocortex and the nervous system override the natural body process of integrating challenging experience. So a few weeks ago, for example, I was out in the back with my son, and my neighbor was getting ready for elk season. And so all of a sudden, I heard the shot, and then I heard the ricochet of a shot, and I knew the bullet was heading toward me and my son. And so it lodged in the barn just a few feet from us. So there are a lot of different options there that I could use. You used the word instinct earlier. So the instinct is, of course, to duck or to run, but the other is to make sure that the nervous system has a way and time and is honored to do whatever it needs to do to integrate that. That's sort of the astral or animal part of the self, and to honor that rather than overriding it and immediately calling the sheriff and so forth and getting into the rational mind, staying in the natural. What would it be? It's like an unfolding of experience that takes place. And there's a way to listen to that and to listen to the body's wisdom rather than overriding it and damping it down, because what happens then is it lodges in a particular, wherever the body is weak, a weak organ system or a weak muscle system, and there's a holding that takes place there. Instead of that energy being allowed to move through, there's an intense amount of energy when survival comes up.
That's where shaking medicine comes from. And that's why animals, after a trauma, shake quite vigorously to move the energy of the trauma through them and out of them and integrate the systems. Because I don't know if you've ever done any shaking work.
Oh, yeah, a lot.
You can quickly find which chakras, for example, are not working well quite easily, because those spinal centers don't move when you shake. You can't get that part of your body to loosen up.
And now you answered your own question, right? Which is, how does the healing take place? You're actually using the catalyst of the bullet coming within a few feet of me and my son to locate the places in the body that have been places that are weak or compromised. And you find that out by having a tremendous influx of energy and finding out where is energy able to travel and where is it not. Now you've transformed trauma into healing, and you've gained a gift from it rather than made yourself weaker.
Yeah, I'm hip to these concepts, but I'm more concerned about the listener.
I figured you were. Yeah.
Not getting lost. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I do a regular physical practice and that I lift stones, because you can't do the kind of stone lifting I do if your body's disintegrated. You'll get yourself hurt real fast. You have to have tremendous balance, coordination, strength, agility, flexibility. I mean, lifting those stones makes anything in a gym look like child's play. In fact, I take people out there in the stones for an hour and say, okay, now go in the gym and try your maximum deadlift. And they are, quite often shocked at how easy what used to be heavy for them to lift comes right up, because their nervous system is now integrated at such a significantly higher level that it shows you how the right activities are necessary to keep the body integrated. If you go to the gym and look at what lifts most people do, they're linear. They're in the sagittal plane. A deadlift, it's front to back. A bench press, it's front to back. A squat, it's front to back. There's hardly any transverse plane or rotational plane movements, which is why I felt it was so important for me to bring the Swiss ball into the exercise industry, because it allowed an easy mechanism that not only integrates you in all 3 planes, but because the ball is unstable, the ball is not unstable. It'll sit on the floor all day long. But because the surface area on the ball is so small and it's round, it mirrors your own instabilities back to you as fast as you lose your center on it. So it's actually like a perfect feedback mechanism to strengthen and integrate the nervous system. Now, I want to go back to this concept of the etheric, because now the words come up several times. You've used it in different ways. You've talked about the etheric field. You've talked about etheric beings. We have the newer concept of Christ as an etheric being. And then, there's another issue that I'm going to put on the table as a foundation, and that is that the etheric field of the body is actually almost like the electromagnetic field created by the biochemical reactions in the body, for which current science says there's about 30 billion chemical reactions a second. Now, to put that into simple perspective, if you take a pendulum and put it over a bowl of water and measure the energy, you'll often get just a small swing, especially if you use tap water. You'll get a very small circle, which shows you there's very little life force. But if you take a teaspoon of salt and stir it into that water and measure it, it'll go up 5-6 times as powerful, because now you have a chemical reaction taking place and you have movement from a crystalline to a liquid form. So there's actually a transformation process which produces energy. So the etheric field of the body, which extends to about a centimeter off the body, is the energy field created by the chemistry of the body and hormonal reactions and all sorts of reactions in the body. And in my third eye, I can actually see, if I look at somebody, even at a distance, where their biochemistry is breaking down, such as if they have a cancer of the pancreas, they will have an area in that field where there's like a hole in it, or it's very weak. And that, by the way, if you're doing shamanic journeys and you're in a neighborhood of entities, they can walk right through these holes in our aura. And if the etheric field is not coherent, you're kind of like someone who leaves the car door open at the gas station with the keys in the car, and you walk in to pay, you turn around and someone's taking off with your car, and you're confused as to why they would steal your car. Metaphor being the entity is like the thief that sees your car wide open and the keys in the ignition, and it's easy access. Whereas the car door being locked is more like what happens when we have a coherent energy field to envelop us, because the energy of the entity is very similar to the frequency of our aura. And so it can move through energy densities that it's at. But because it doesn't have a physical body, it does not have an etheric field. So that etheric field creates a sort of a impossibility wall in a healthy person. The entity it's very hard for them to penetrate that field. So that's one level of the etheric field, but that's not the level that you're talking about. You're talking about something else. And how are you distinguishing ether from aether, which is in quantum physics or in metaphysics would be the first step out of the eternal now, or from God into manifestation, which would be the first step of manifestation of spirit itself. So if you can bring some clarity to etheric field, etheric beings, etheric Christ, and how does that different from aether?
Yeah, so I think that's the Michelson-Morley experiment for ether, the AETHER, and they tried to debunk that, again, 150 years ago. So there was in the 1800s a tremendous amount of thought and experimentation around what that ether was, and essentially it is this always in motion force that creates life. It's a life body. It creates. It also is a storage place for memory, and so for the human being, that ether life is that memory stored around the body, not actually in the body, and it's the source for habits. And so that ether force is always flowing toward us, always informing us. It's what animates the material body and overlights it. As you said, it's larger, slightly larger than the material body. And as it forms it, then the actual feeling body or life body or experience body or emotional body, those would all be the same name for this kind of starry body that is what the soul can inhabit and have experiences around. That overlights then that ether portion. And all of those three bodies, the material, the ether, and the astral, then have an I being. That's the conscious being, the lower part of which is called the ego, which usually gets in the way. But the higher part of the I being is always invisible and is always connected to the greater ether, if you will. And that ether is what gets connected with consciously by the human being through the third eye, through meditation. It's called the form maker. That once you're connected to that ether, you're connected to intelligent infinity. Intelligent infinity in a conscious way allows you to be what Steiner would call the highest level of initiation on the earth would be an adept. An adept is able to work with intuition consciously. The stage below that intelligent infinity connection, where you enter that gateway, would be the stage of inspiration, where you're able to work with beings, but you don't have the capacity to live in nothingness, because there's a so-called death of the I being that has to take place when you move into intuition. And that's why it's the highest level of initiation, because you risk the annihilation of the self. And again, we've talked before about plant medicines, and some experiences give you an experience of that, but you can achieve that, of course, on your own without any kind of medicine through meditation. And obviously, Steiner didn't work with any plant medicines. He worked with his own consciousness to get to that level of what he would call the sun initiation rather than the moon initiation. The solar initiation is that ether initiation, where in broad daylight of consciousness, step by step, just like you did with the circuits. And how did you get through every one of these 10 steps you had to go through? The initiate who's at the adept level is able to move through those steps forward, backward, sideways, can start at any one of them and move any direction. And that's the ether that we're talking about. It is this kind of intelligence that forms. It's an energy that's called vitality, as opposed to Julius Mayer's conservation of energy, where you only have a certain amount of energy. In this kind of energy, the more you give, the more you have to give. The human being is able to transform matter. And at death, then, we actually give that transformation of matter back to the earth as a gift. And that's what allows the earth to continue, is this ether energy that we materialize and then transform it. Steiner has a saying where he says that the laboratory in the scientist's room must become an altar again. This is where another way to say the material of the body and all that the ether brings to it has to be transformed by our I consciousness. And that ether then is an eternal kind of ether, where St. Francis, for example, still has an etheric body that was honed and toned by his teacher, who was the Buddha, and he's still his teacher. So to get to the Christ picture of what is that Christ etheric, it's an incorruptible body that's accessible to all of us at any time. And so when people talk about Christ returning, it's Christ returning in that etheric presence that now we're able to access, because at death, he took that transformed substance and placed it into the earth. That's what it meant by Christ inhabited the earth. It's the transformation of substance, ether substance, that he then placed into the earth that's now accessible to all of us. This gets back to your question around when we can do initiation on our own. We couldn't do initiation on our own before that deed actually happened, before a human being transformed that substance at that level, because we literally had to be transported to the sun for a sun initiation. But now that sun being inhabited the earth, created that substance in the earth, and now creates the possibility for the earth to become a sun, to become a star, for a moving planet to become a resting star at some point in the future. That's what that capacity created for the earth and for all who will continue to live on the earth. I hope that makes sense in terms of the ether.
Yeah, for me, it brings up all sorts of things that would require a whole podcast to really dissect. The primary one being that you're speaking of Jesus Christ as a literal human being, for which I could throw up a whole long list of very profound challenges. And I've investigated it very thoroughly because of all the problems that creates.
Let's do it. Let's do another podcast on that. That sounds fun.
I think we should.
Steiner was raised in a very free-thinking family, agnostic at best, and he came in a hard-won reality to the fact that the event at Golgotha, this transformation of substance of this being, enabled the planet to continue and is the most seminal event for human beings. So when we say, what is a human being, that would be his picture of it, and he has a lot of reasons as to why. So it does sound like a fun one.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I imagine you know that magnesium is one of the minerals that people in North America are the most deficient in, but it's an extremely important mineral to have in your diet regularly. And believe it or not, Bioptimizers has improved what was already well known to be the best magnesium formula out there called Magnesium Breakthrough. So I've got Wade Lightheart with me to explain what it is they've done to improve this already excellent formula. Wade, what is new about your new Mag Breakthrough formula?
Well, it's called sucrosomial magnesium. So we have 7 different types of magnesium in Magnesium Breakthrough because they're uptaken by different parts of the body. But a new type of magnesium has been created called sucrosomial. And what it shows in the research in science is that it's actually even more absorbable by the body, particularly inside of the brain, which is a big aspect to enhance neurotransmitter formation as well as ensuring the rest and relax response in the nervous system that a lot of people will take magnesium for. They find it, clocks them down, helps them sleep better, allows for the relaxation of striated and smooth muscle tissue in the body, which creates an energetic relief. And so when we added sucrosomial, we were able to demonstrate inside our lab facility that we were able to get better improvements. Of course, we have a partnership with the Birch International University. We have some patents we're working on, which will kind of relay some of these things. But sucrosomial was a no-brainer when we added to the formula, improved the results or improved the uptake. And the reports back from our testing team were like, wow, we get more results with less caps. And that's always the goal for our company.
That's excellent. I love it. I always say, and people have probably heard me say it before, I'm so amazed how you guys are constantly and always improving and working your best to not only make better products for us, but it doesn't seem to me that it gets more expensive as you make them better. So that's a real gift to the world. Thank you.
Bioptimizers offers Living 4D with Paul Chek listeners 10% off Magnesium Breakthrough and all their other products. Plus, there are always amazing gifts with purchase. So to grab yours, go to bioptimizers.com/living4D and use the promo code Paul10 when you check out. That's bioptimizers.com/living, the number 4D, and the discount code is Paul10.
One thing I'd like to touch on, and that relates to the eye. I've investigated this very, very deeply, both naturally and on very profoundly deep plant medicine ceremonies. And your description that you just gave of the eye differs from mine. And the difference is that when I track my eye back, I end up in the eternal now, one with God conscious. And I find that the eye that is witnessing in me, and what I find is that the eye witnessing in all of us, is actually God dreaming itself into existence so that it can experience love through relationship, without which it cannot know itself. And without the universe, God can have no means of self-reflection, because unconditional love can't possibly know anything, because that takes the unconditional and leaves it to be conditional. And therefore, there would be no capacity for an I. It is the fact that God's love is unconditional that the I can exist, because it is empty of everything so that it can contain everything. And a simple analogy for that is, if you stand in front of a mirror, it always reflects back to you exactly what is in it. In other words, whatever light reaches it is reflected back. But it's only because the mirror is empty of itself. If the mirror, for example, had a painting of a scenery on it, then you would only see the painting of the scenery, except for the areas where there was nothing covering the emptiness of the mirror. So God is ultimately the divine mirror that is reflecting its dream that it is projecting out of itself, which is what all these layers of energy are. They're actually the holographic matrix of God's own dream, which creates the condensation of consciousness, which is the living mirror of God's dream, which is what everything is, what we are. So the point that I'm making is, your description of the I, as Steiner teaches it, ends up, you said, in the 6th dimension. But when I track my I back, no matter which method I use, I end up in a state of complete non-being, where there is nothing there. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to describe. It's not awareness. It's no thing. In fact, in plant medicine ceremonies, in times when I've entered it, it literally scared me half to death, which is why I had to go investigate it without the use of plant medicines, because to truly enter into that state, you have to have a complete and utter death of the self, of the ego, of the sense of identity. And in one ceremony I was in, very, very deep, I got right to the edge of dissolving into that oneness of God, or the emptiness of God. And I said inside of myself, I'm afraid. And I heard what I would only describe as the voice of God say, if you trust me, let go. And I said, I trust you, but I'm afraid. And God said, there's nothing to be afraid of. And I said, but I feel like I'm going to die. And God said, what is death? And I said, well, I have a responsibility to my family and to the Institute, and I don't feel safe to let go, because if I don't come back, it'll create so much damage to everything that I came to the world to do. Then God said something quite profound. God said, you have a choice, Paul. You can always do one of two things: trust me or trust yourself, and either of those is just fine. And I said, well, because I don't know what will happen if I fully let go to the trust that you're saying is trust is you. But I know that right now, if I stay here, I can make it home to my obligations. And I've done over 1,000 plant medicine ceremonies in my life. So I know I have a very strong sense of experience and dimension and travel. But I was at the point where I could feel if I let go one tiny bit more, then there would be no I within the self.
Yes.
To have the relationship with God. It would be nirvana, to blow out, to extinguish. If I get to the point in my life where I can let go of responsibilities, my family's safe, I will do that. But I did not feel that it would be respectful to Penny and to my children and to the people that I have a responsibility to let go and trust God, because I also know that you have to be very, very careful with voices like that, because there can be other beings that are pretending to be God. And so I had to put family and responsibility before I could actually authentically run that test fully, because the risk of, it's kind of like being a test pilot. You're testing imagine the first one to test the spy plane, what is it, the SR-77, I think it is, that flies at 2 or 3 times the speed of sound and outruns missiles and all that. You don't know if the thing's going to hold up at those speeds. So every time you go up and test something like that, it could be your last run. But you see, the point I'm making is that my own investigations have shown me beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I've tested this over and over again, that what is actually witnessing me, to be conscious, a Homo sapien means one who is aware that they are aware.
Right. Self-conscious. Yeah.
It's only because of the I that I can witness myself thinking and talking to you right now. And that's really what makes me conscious as an individual. Otherwise, I would just be acting out like a robot, not even knowing why I'm doing it. Artificial intelligence, for example, can never have an I in this context. So it will never actually be official intelligence. It'll always be information processing. It can never become, at least not as I can conceive it as a human being. Maybe some very advanced race of beings has accomplished how to do that. But anyhow, I just felt I needed to share that with you, because
it's important.
Well, not only that, because Steiner does say that, but as much as I love Steiner, I have to also say I have to trust and honor and respect my own investigations. Otherwise, I'm just a blind follower, and I wouldn't want any of my students to blindly follow me. I always tell them, don't believe anything I say, go test it.
Right. Well, let me try to put the I in a little bit of a perspective that may be helpful. When the 21-year-old is in that 21 to 28-year phase, the I is very dull and torporous. It's dreamy, because it's not able to come into that strong sympathy and antipathy feeling that we have when we're in our 20s and trying to find our way toward truth. when we get to the intellectual soul development from 28 to 35, the I is operating consciously, but it's not operating self-consciously. So it's operating almost at an animal level. It's able to move. It can work sort of reflexively or instinctually out of impulse. But that's the only inlet level that the I has. When we get to the consciousness soul, the I for the first time can work self-consciously. It can work with self-awareness. And that's the three levels of the soul that develop from 21 to 42. Now at 42, the first of the three aspects of a spirit development come in. And this is life spirit, and then spirit self and spirit man. Each one of these they're a spirit development. That means there's a wider aperture for the I being to come in. And these three periods of time, from 42 to 49, from 49 to 56, from 56 to 63, actually mirror the first 3 years of life, when the highest beings are able to work with us as infants, bringing a consciousness of I as a window. And that's when the 3-year-old, instead of saying Edmund, says I for the first time. There's this window. And there are these windows of I beingness that come in throughout childhood and the lifespan. It happens at that age of 3, because right at that age, in the first 7 years, the child is a being of will. They do everything out of the love of the activity. But there are little sections within the first 7-year period where there's the thinking part of the will, there's the willing part of the will, and there's the feeling part of the will, for about 2.3 years for each of those. So right at that window where the willing is shifting into the willing feeling, there's this concept of, oh, I am an I. There's this glimpse or flash like lightning of the I that comes in. And I think you and I are saying the same thing in different language. I think it's a semantic question, because that I is that higher being. It's the higher self is not the totality, because there's a mind, body, spirit totality, which is beyond the higher self, and beyond that is the creator itself. And that is what I think a lot of people for nirvana or samadhi, enlightenment, are looking for, is that. But what Steiner's actually hoping for is the reverse of that, which is that the I is able to penetrate all the way down through all of the 9 different bodies and become active in all of those bodies. And that's what Waldorf education is all about, is creating a wider and wider aperture for the I to come through to the planet to incarnate, not for us to be somehow enlightened and leave the planet. He guards against that in the strongest way possible. In his mantras, when you're getting off body and you're able to think freely because you're outside of the body for the first time, he immediately has questions for you. He says, what becomes of the air that supported you, the earth that supported you? What becomes of the warmth that supported you in your body? And if you say, oh, I don't need it anymore, then what would happen is you'd lose your connection to your body, to the earth. You'd lose your responsibility to your kids and to your wives and to your mission on the planet, which is the most important thing. And he says this for him very strongly. He leaves us in freedom so much, but he says really this must never take place, because the whole point we're here is to bring the I in through all of these 9 different bodies, to ground it into the planet and to make that aperture as wide as possible. And yeah, that is the creator experiencing itself. So I think you and I are saying the same thing, are we?
If you're saying it's the creator experiencing itself, then yes, we are. I think maybe where I got hung up is you said the I being emanates from the 6th dimension, but I'm saying that my experience is that it emanates from the 0 dimension.
Yeah, I mean, Ra would call it the dimension between 8 and 1, which is the 0 dimension. Steiner doesn't say that it emanates from the 6th dimension, so I misspoke. It's more the being of the higher self is at the 6th dimension. That's the being that instructs the angel, which is supporting us. So the angel is in this 4th dimension that we talked about, the next dimension above our own. The higher self in the 6th dimension is instructing the angel to then work with us. And the angel is basically intuitive thought. It's instantaneous thought that's connected to the ether.
Yeah, interesting. I might as well go with this since we're so deep into it. But when I talk to my highest self, which I do fairly regularly, because there's a difference between the soul and the highest self. I've investigated the self very deeply. The components of the self, as I've identified them through my own internal investigations, are the unconscious, the highest self, the soul, and the ego. And those are like 4 components to beingness itself. You can't exist as a human being without those 4 elements. In other words, there would not be a self to generate you in the matrix. You're coming from, I could go through each of those components, but that would be more than I want to try to do in this podcast, because we'd have to go through a lot of steps and a lot of discussion, and you and I have to make clarifications. But the key point I want to say is I've asked myself multiple times, where exactly are you from a dimensional perspective, from a space-time or time-space perspective? And the answer I get is, I am God's dream of you in your perfected state. I am essentially an attractor drawing you toward your potential. It is because I exist that you have the urge to continue to learn and to grow and to heal and to experience. It's because I exist as one with the ultimate truth of God that you know when you're loving and not loving, that you know when you're being truthful or not truthful, that you know when it's time to move on in your career. It's me that's led you from the study of anatomy and physiology to the study of psychology to the study of all the things that you've investigated in, because I'm the one that knows when you have acquired enough knowledge and experience that going further does not move you toward your evolutionary process. In other words, if I didn't listen to that, I could have ended up becoming rich selling Swiss balls and just left it there and just, hung around with everybody and threw big parties, and my evolution would have ceased because I would have fallen into the trap of financial success. And so I've actually said to my soul and to my highest self, I want to get this clear. I draw a line. I say this line represents 0. This is a sine wave that represents life force, energy, or spirit, the creative impulse of God. Where are you, my dear highest self? My highest self says, I am the point of emergence from the line of 0, which you call God. I am simultaneously God and you. Think of if I took Edmund's body and painted one half white and one half any other color. The white represents God and the other half represents manifestation. My highest self says, I am right there. I am the point. In Hindu philosophy, I am the nada bindu point. Nada, sound, bindu, seed, sound, creation. I am the nada bindu of you. And the nada bindu itself can be represented as the Tai Chi symbol, and the blackness of it is the unconscious, and the white of it is the conscious, and the central point is the God that is neither but everything. And so I bring this up because the highest self, as my own highest self tells me, is way beyond the 6th dimension. It's straddling the 0 dimension and projecting itself through every dimension.
Yeah. It's funny because there's the higher self, and again, I think it's semantics. Then there's this totality which is beyond the higher self, and then there is this capacity to approach, what I could only call the threshold. And this, there have been individuals on the planet who have been at this level of being able to approach that threshold, and just as you did in the moment of stepping into the non-I status. Those individuals all looked behind them and realized that they wanted to continue serving in a particular way in their mission, almost to a person. And they all had the choice, 100% with no judgment, to move forward or not. But the consciousness that you have when you're in that state is often one of wanting to turn and lend a hand to those behind you. And that if you want to call that the I being, I think the challenge is there isn't a language at that level.
No, it is very tricky. And, you're describing something very, very real. And I'll tell you, Edmund, and everyone listening, every time I've been to that state, I have often have a lot of tears coming out of me because I see how committed God is to its own self-realization and how much pain God is in by being the human kingdom and by being the animal kingdom and all the living beings, but particularly human beings go through so much sacrifice to support God's own evolution. And so what I see is, it reminds me of when Osho says every child is born God and the parents beat it out of them. I have had so much profound, and I'm clairvoyant, so I can actually see what's going on in people's lives if I want to look into them. And it was so intense, I had to ask my soul to shut it down unless I specifically asked to see, because it was overwhelming me tremendously and just leaving me feeling so heartbroken everywhere I went to see how much pain people carry. But when I'm in that state that I've just described and that we were talking about, and I can look back into the world, I see how utterly committed God is to its own self-realization and how much pain God is in, and how God is willing to go through all this death and all this trauma and all this child abuse and life abuse. But it is because God is so committed to the truth of itself that it cannot negate the negative, the darkness, or the evil. And it's as committed to this thing we call evil or darkness as it is to the good. And when you have reached a point in your life where love really has more than an intellectual sense of meaning, it's got a substantive meaning. Like, when you really realize how powerful love is and what it ultimately is, not only for us, but for God, and the importance of love, it is very, very hard for me as a human being, as a soul, to seek nirvana, because I see how important it is for me to help other people awaken so that they can realize that God's not something you read about in books. God's not something that you go to church to get a bunch of ideas in your head. That actually stops people from getting to the real experience of God, which is why Rumi said, to get to God, you got to become a heretic. When you smell a flower, you're smelling God. When you pet your cat or your dog, you're loving God. When you help somebody genuinely in need, you're helping God. When you do like you do, Edmund, and work with special needs children, you're helping God, who's taken on a challenge so deep for both mom and dad and the child and God, that it takes a very evolved person to be able to manage that level of challenge as a parent and a guide. I mean, I have tremendous respect for parents that have very challenged special needs children, because you're dealing with God who's reached a level where it needs that level of challenge to grow. Paradoxically, we look on a lot of these people like they're less than human or broken or whatever, but often, it's actually a sage in a body like that saying, this is what I need to do to grow. It's a real, I've had profound experiences in my meditation and my astral work and my work with archetypes, my remote viewing plant medicine ceremonies, that actually just kind of shatter your mind. It can take me sometimes months to really wrap my head around how do I integrate that into my life to the best I can, so that so it goes from being a temporary experience to a lived reality. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of legitimate spiritual growth, is because the ego has such a crystalline nature. It likes to form into these rigid patterns. And it's kind of like a shamanic journey is like salt hitting water, and then it becomes one with everything. But then the water evaporates, and all of a sudden you're back to the crystal again, but you remember the experience. And so it's really quite a task. I think real spiritual development is to metaphorically not let the water of the experience and the power of God consciousness evaporate so quickly, because you can become the same village idiot after 25 or 125 shamanic journeys or plant medicine journeys that you were at the very beginning, because you keep recrystallizing and you still carry out these same destructive behaviors. You still can't manage yourself. You still don't take care of yourself. You still abort key relationships. And I think that that's a real tightrope right there. That's a very, and it doesn't matter whether you're using drugs or not. I mean, I could say everything I've just said about advanced meditators, because I know plenty of them who have all the same problems that psychedelic users do, but they do 60-day meditation
Oh yeah.
retreats.
Oh yeah.
And boy, they're all blissed out, and I'm like, good, but look, you still can't eat right, you still don't go to the gym, you're still falling apart, you still ask the questions of a child. I think what we're describing here is really one of the paradoxes of being in this 3D plus time physical form. And that's of course Ahriman, that is the agent of crystallization, the agent of creating form. Lucifer is the one that says, hey, take another hit of DMT, man, let's get out of here.
Dissolve it, let's expand.
But what I'm talking about is the Christ consciousness in the middle that says, Paul, really feel this. Don't run after that. Don't get too fixated on money and material belongings and prestige, but really sit with it. Let the tears flow, really. And this is what the alchemists call cooking. Be really like cooking it. This is what Jung calls holding the tension of the opposites. And it's a hard thing to do, because like the pain of my brother committing suicide. It took me many, many journeys to heal that. Paradoxically, do you see how this ties right into what it means to be truly human and to be a free thinker?
Absolutely.
What we're exploring here are concepts that a lot of people don't want to look at. They don't want to talk about because they're a fear of getting attacked, and it's a legitimate fear because many people have been burned at the stake. If I was having this conversation with you in the 1500s, in earshot of any religious orthodoxy, you and I would have been deeply intimate brothers as we both burned on a cross facing each other, and all of God's little children celebrating that the blasphemers were now gone. I think you and I both have committed ourselves to really looking into these mysteries, not for any reason other than our own need to know, our own need to understand, and our own quest to really have a deeper, more legitimate, more honest relationship with this, whatever God is, right? I mean, I would love to hear if that's true for you. I mean, what drives you into all this?
Well, I mean, what touched me deeply is seeing you at the threshold, and first of all, feeling you slow down, feeling you ask a question, feeling you hear the answer, and then entertain a dialogue. And it's clear from that whole process that you're maintaining a sense of all of those four bodies that you talked about. So in other words, the ego or personality is online, the higher part of you is online, and you're looking at the choice that you can make, and you're recognizing that you're bringing a kind of a consciousness toward the being who's in front of you. It's not all about Paul. It's actually about this being that is going through a tremendous amount. You're actually tracking that, you're monitoring that, and you're holding the responsibilities that you have behind you as a personality that you could so easily let go of in this moment. And I'm deeply touched by that, because when I got my doctorate in clinical psychology, it was transpersonally focused. And I remember the number of individuals who were going to go out and work with people who had such a strong interest in becoming enlightened. And I always felt that was incredibly short-sighted and immature and really wrong-headed, because it isn't about your enlightenment. It's about your capacity to help others enlighten themselves. And through doing that, we become enlightened, because we have to know all the steps to enlightenment in order to serve in that way. And that's the way I experience you. And since I first met you, and we just dropped in together early in the morning in your studio there, and I don't know what we were reading, Dionysius the Areopagite, or
Yeah, I think it might have been
somebody.
yeah.
And we just wandered through the realm of beings and ideas, and it was clear to me that your heart was stalwart toward serving individuals, and that you would only take out of that what you could offer. And that's a resonance that I have that inspires me to have conversations with you. And so I would say that that's my experience of coming to the edge of an experience of a higher being, And what you did was you actually moved into that being and maintained your selfhood, if you will, in order to learn more to bring back. I think that's the work. I think that is widening your aperture and bringing more of your I being back to serve your kids and your wives and your gym and whatever your mission is. And I think that's our task, is to be able to keep ourselves anchored in ourselves and tethered, and to go as far as we possibly can, right to the limit of that allness, that singularity, and then to draw back the substance that comes toward us as a result of that exercise. And I think it's an extreme exercise because,
Oh, it is.
yeah, the heart just feels almost torn apart by feeling the potential and the capacity for what humanity can achieve, and then knowing as you said, like sort of the salt crystals that you're going to come back to, and then the work begins again the next day.
Always. Yeah, it's profound. And I've never been somebody who is seeking enlightenment. I just have big questions, and I hate walking around with questions in my head. And I feel as a teacher, it's my responsibility to answer the biggest questions I can answer, because if I can ask the question, so can somebody else. If it's important to me, I feel I've got to do the work to get the answer. And the problem that I have is that when a real question comes up, it's like skunk smell. The damn thing won't leave me alone. You know, a good example is, how many dimensions are there? I can put 25 books in front of you with all these different dimensional models, all written by experts, from Barbara Hand-Clough, a Cherokee record keeper who is very tapped in, to from Yogananda to whoever you want, right? You
And
know,
the
I
answer
got to.
is yes, because there are infinite dimensions, so they're all
Right.
right.
And so what do? You say, okay, well, how do I promote any of this stuff? I have to go figure it out for myself. So I went and I got a model, and I can share. I think I might have sent it to you, but I said to myself, I've got to get the truth on this, because it's too confusing, and to buy into any one of these models now just means you're indoctrinated, because you don't know for sure. I just failed the test when my math instructor says, show me the steps. I can pawn any of these models off on my students and say, this is it. And they, unfortunately, might believe me, a lot of them. But now I've got to carry the karma of that.
Right.
So all I'm saying is, enlightenment is such an open-ended, illusory thing, because what do you realize? Every level you go to, there's new challenges of being at that level. So you can have to be enlightened an infinite number of times, So what's the point? What I say is more important than enlightenment is are you really living? Are you really being authentically yourself? Are you expressing the divine in you, the genius that's in every soul? Are you doing what your heart knows you're here to do? Because even when it hurts, you know it's the right thing to do. And if you can't do that, I don't care how enlightened you are by social new age spiritual terms, you're not enlightened at all.
No, the whole concept of enlightenment has been misperceived as that I need to go somewhere. I need to reach a certain level. But instead, it's how wide can I become to bring creator through all that I'm experiencing as a human being on this planet. I'm enlightening myself and hopefully all those around me in every moment, if that's the case. Otherwise, I'm shirking my responsibility.
Yeah, I think too, because I've been injured very badly so many times, I've always had this realization that I couldn't trust doctors and therapists, because oftentimes all they said was, you should stop racing motorcycles. You should stop letting people punch you in the head. Don't you know boxing damages your brain? And, I always got these kind of canned answers that just don't work for a pioneering spirit. It's like, get out of my hair with that shit. That's like telling a kid that falls off their bike and skins their knee, oh, you see, you shouldn't ride bicycles, right? Well,
Right.
what are you going to do? Put your fucking kid in a petri dish, and surround them with social media and say, there it is. You got everything you need.
You're safe.
Die happily
Safe.
while we give you Soylent Green through your feeding tube. It's just so stupid. But I had to, in moments of desperation, there's nothing like waking up after wiping a motorcycle out so bad you got multiple broken bones, you got internal bleeding, you're cut to shreds, and you get up in the morning and you're glued to the sheet, and it's going to take you half an hour to peel your shit off so you can even go to the toilet. And I'm like, I've been in these situations where like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this situation. I hurt from head to toe. Even my thoughts hurt. And so I had to go deeper into myself and talk to my body and say, what do I do? I don't know what to do. You got to tell me what to do. And so that process taught me how to work with my body as I grew up and went through all these challenges and then became a therapist and realized, wow, most doctors and therapists really don't know anything about working with pain. They just know that they're trying to get rid of it. But when you try to get rid of it, you never get rid of it. You just push it down, and it's like a seed of, that just won't die. It'll just keep coming up. And if it doesn't come out the spot that they medicated, it'll pop out somewhere else. And so anyhow,
just as impossible to seek enlightenment as it is to avoid pain.
Yeah. So in other words, if you learn how to work with it, it becomes like clay. You can make something out of it. But if you keep putting the tape over the oil light on the dashboard, and one day you're going to get a big surprise when your engine seizes up while you're driving 70 miles an hour. The next thing you know, you're in a 14-car pileup because your rear wheel's locked up. Edmund, the problem with you is I go into a trance state and I feel like I'm in such a bliss state I'm like a dolphin swimming with another dolphin, just jumping and playing and riding the waves. And it's just I think too, what I'd like to share in that regard is this is like why it's so important to seek out friends that have more depth than you do in certain areas or different diverse opinions. Because like when I was a martial artist, some of my friends were badass martial artists and they could push me to the very limits of myself, And as much as I hated getting beat up, my motto was, if you can beat me, I'm going to be the first guy to give you a hug and a kiss because I know how hard you're going to have to work to do it. So if someone could beat me, I knew that I had met my new teacher and I had to study them and learn from them. Not that I'm competing with you in that sense, but I just mean that camaraderie that's one of the things I loved about being a paratrooper is that the strength of the camaraderie, like when you could be facing death, and your brothers become like your arms and limbs, that we're all like one organism working together. And it takes you to a spiritual experience. I'll give one example before we move on. I'll never forget the first year I was a paratrooper. Every year they have the 82nd Airborne Division March. And there's 14,000 paratroopers at that time. And we're all marching simultaneously, singing together. And the frickin' power of 14,000 men marching down a 4-lane highway singing in cadence is something phenomenal. And it gave me flashbacks to past life experiences going off to battle with drummers. And it's just like, it's trippy. But for the listeners to understand how powerful it is, whenever we would get to a bridge, we would have to go out of step. Because if we marched across the bridge in step, it would collapse the bridge. And you can drive 5 army tanks in a row across these bridges, no problem. But once you have, like one bridge we had to cross was probably, I would imagine, 150 yards across. It was like a full steel bridge, like a 4-lane highway. And literally, they'd make us go out of step because the engineers said it could collapse the bridge with that much. Because when all of our feet hit the ground at exactly the same time, the shock wave is enough to fracture the steel structures and the concrete. When you realize how much power there is with people moving together like that, you can really see how if we as human beings could really get clear on how much we love each other, how much we need each other, and how much we love and need nature, and how important it is to protect Mother Nature, we could eradicate a lot of the
instantaneously
silly crap going on in the world really quickly. And I think that's one of the main reasons that I started Spirit Gym, that I started the Institute, that I really just wanted to help bring people into a deeper awareness of what's really important if you want to be a healthy human being and a free thinker, and really become a human being, and I think that's really what the motto of our dialogue today is. What is it to be a free thinker? What does it really mean to be human? But with the remaining little bit of time we have left today, I'd like to touch on some of the concepts you're going to be sharing in your upcoming group with Jared, because they're very integral to Steiner's philosophy and teachings, but there are also a lot of things that are very diffuse and confusing to most people, or they have canned ideas about them. So to begin with, let's start with pure thinking. I've done some pure thinking work because I've studied Zen Buddhism. I've studied different practices in Buddhism. I've done a variety of pure thinking meditations. I did them for years and I found them very powerful. So why don't you give us an expose of pure thinking? Because these are all these upcoming things: pure thinking, willing and mastering of actions, equanimity, connectedness, openness, harmonizing and balancing. They're like the center point of your training program, if
Yeah,
I understand it right.
you bet. The gift that Steiner brings to anything is his stepwise progression of using the body to get to off-body experiences, so that by the time you're off-body, you're completely prepared to return to your body. For thinking, for example, he gives a picture of 12 different thinking types as being the primary categories that human beings move into. And usually when we're born, we have one of those predominant types. And each one of those types is connected to many other 12-fold systems or qualities. So for example, Plato was, as most people know, very much working out of idealism. And idealism is connected with the sense of speech. And Steiner goes through, when educating the human being, the child, for example, he goes through 4 body senses: touch, movement, life, and balance. And those are 4 body senses that we teach the young child how to master. Then we move into soul senses, and I'm not going to get into why they're soul senses, but they're more connected with touch and taste and smell and even warmth, the sense of soul warmth, not just the temperature warmth. Those are more in the middle years of a child's life. They get developed. And then finally, as the child moves into young adulthood, into later high school and so forth, the 4 higher senses would be not body or soul senses, but spirit senses. And those would be the sense of, how do I hear? Speech is one of them. So this sense of Plato's idealism is connected to that. What is my sense of thinking? And then with that thinking is, what is my sense of the other? How do I understand the other human being? And that's the 12 senses that we teach children. And then when we get into teaching adults through Waldorf colleges, it's 3 more higher senses, which are imagination, inspiration, and intuition. Once you've developed those 15 senses, you're off and running and able to work with pure thinking. And that's what I love about Steiner, is he builds this thing from the ground up. He builds it from the moment of birth, and this is how we work. The child works out of willing and imitation in the beginning. Then they work out of imagination. Then they work out of the growing sense of inspiration. And each one of these is developed within a body system, and he works with the sense of breathing. And basically he says that thinking is refined breathing. And we have to teach this young child how to breathe on this planet, that they don't naturally come with a sense of how to breathe. And it's not just the physical breathing he's talking about that turns into thinking, but it's an invisible kind of spatial breathing. So first, as you talked about with this Zen practice of pure thinking, we always start in Zen by paying attention to the breath until the breath actually breathes us. And we recognize that there is non-doing that takes place here. And there's even a kind of a non-thinking that takes place that is pure thinking. And that's, all these things are kind of like a Zen koan, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what's good, because that's what it takes to crack
Yes.
the conditioned mind open.
To crack the intellect, and
Yeah.
for the intellect and the ego and the personality, they all get their heyday in the sun, and then finally there's something that they look up and they realize, oh wow, that's what that is. And so these different kinds of thinking are operating ideally in any individual, and you come in strongly with one sense. Maybe it's materialism, maybe it's spiritualism, maybe it's pneumatism, and each of these are connected to one of the senses of the body and also a portion of the body or a body part. And so getting a channel in learning how to access, you can choose a sense to do it, you can choose a thought process to do it, you can use an embodied meditation to do it. So Steiner gives a lot of avenues for us. In the training that we do, we also use a lot of artistic work, and so mandala work and so forth, and we use your dreamline.
Yeah, awesome. I love artwork. I personally, for me, I think one of the greatest moments of my life was when I first studied with Rowena Kreider, who is, I think you've heard me talk about her, very, very powerful shaman. And she started me on mandala therapy, and it broke something open inside of me. And I have drawn and painted, probably be safe to say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 or 2,000 mandalas since then. And
Yeah.
it really just, it was like there was so much caught inside of me that I now realize is coming from a lot of past lives that I never really found a way to get it out. But
Mm.
the amount of amazing experiences I've had helping people with really complex life issues through art and how it's opened them up. I've seen such amazing transformations through art that I will never, ever, ever, if I live 1,000 more lifetimes, not have art involved in my life or my therapeutic life. I could talk for hours and hours about art. I can't overstate enough.
You'd be totally aligned with Steiner and his artistic approach to all of education, and that the teacher must be an artist.
Oh, shit. You see how many videos I've got out there in the world with me drawing on the blackboard because
Yeah.
I am actually
Thinking.
taking people into the experience. If you watch the videos, I'm drawing the art to capture the part of your mind that your ego does not have control of.
No access. No access.
I'm saying, I'm
Yeah.
going to get past your firewall. You don't have to agree with anything I say. As soon as you look at these diagrams, the truth will get you. I mean, a good example, if you look at the Tai Chi symbol, whether you understand it or not, you understand it at a deep level
Right.
because
Right.
it's fundamental.
Yeah. Yeah, so we go into these different qualities of thinking, and the cool thing about Steiner is Ra has this too. Ra considers us a mind, body, spirit complex. Steiner says that we're composed of three different bodies of thinking and feeling and willing, and there's a fourth which is also there, which is this sensing body. And so each area of thinking is predominantly coming out of one of those. Some of us are willing thinkers, for example. We're either called a dynamist or a monadist. And those are individuals that strongly live in forces and energies and vitality. And everything comes from that kind of a component. So just about every contribution that comes out of that person is very much alive and very vigorous. Whereas somebody that would be like Napoleon's thinking, for example. He would be a dynamist, whereas a pneumatist, pneuma means this fifth element in Greek, the ether.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who brings warmth to that would be someone like St. Francis, as I was mentioning. There's warmth in everything that is brought in pneumatism because it's starting to bring all beings together, but it doesn't go to the level of spiritism where someone like Aristotle would be a spiritist. What he does is line out categories of things and parses out spiritual hierarchies. Steiner actually does the same thing, and some people would say that he is or was his intellect is Aristotle. There are certainly similarities there, no matter whether that's the case or not. But that individual, categorical, very discrete parsing of where, kind of like when you ask the question, like, where are you located in space and time? Okay, I being. Okay, higher self. Okay, give me orientation. That's what a spiritist is looking to do. A pneumatist is a stage before that, and a stage before that would be a psychist, like Buddha. Buddha just expanded and was present and was more and more himself, which would be called an adept. The psychist connects with hearing. And the cool thing about hearing as opposed to seeing, for example, is more of the blood is engaged in the process of hearing and more nerve is engaged in the process of the eyes because they're direct extrusions of the brain embryologically as we're formed. So hearing music, for example, or listening to spiritual beings gives us a much wider palette for feeling. Whereas with the eye, we have much more of an objectivity and a capacity for antipathy, which is why, for example, a lot of people like to listen more and more to individuals talking about information rather than reading, because as the age of the consciousness soul comes in and we move more toward pure thinking, we move more toward objectivity, which means antipathy, which means in order for us to come back to ourselves, we have to have antipathy. But the difficulty and the danger there is we could lose our love for humanity as we spiritually develop. We could become pretty solipsistic, just myopically tapped into ourselves, but unable to reach out and connect with the other. And so hearing is a sense, the more blood there is in a sense activity, the more feeling life will be engaged in that. And what we'll basically do is work around the wheel of these different thinking types and engage each individual in which ones of these, is there a predominant thinking type that I'm moving out of? Is there one that's the weakest? And is there a way that I can start to bring these together so that I can call upon the thinking type that I need with the activity that I'm engaged in? Because, for example, we talked a little bit about mathematism earlier. Mathematism or Pythagoras as the individual who exemplifies that, this is the I being. And the higher part of the I being is creator. The lower part is the ego that just wants to grab greedily everything and dissolve information for itself. Or Moses as a rationalist. He's like an archetype for that. That's the quality of thinking still at the embodied level before it goes off body. So once you come around the circle, your whole body is integrated because you've worked with the 12 senses, you've worked with the 12 aspects of thinking, and you start to recognize that there's a 13th, and the 13th is the self, and the 13th integrates all of these. It's like throughout history, there have always been, whether it's Parzival or Arthur or Christian Rosenkreuz or Christ or Buddha, you name it, there have been 12 disciples, but there's 12 disciples around a 13th, and that 13th is the self. And that's
the center.
Yeah, the unification.
Wait till you see my mandala for
Woo!
2025.
So that in
Think of what you just said when I show it to you.
I will. I'm sure it'll hit me right in the forehead.
Maybe the heart.
And I hope, yeah. So that's just a quick picture of how Steiner develops thinking and what we'll be working toward to make ourselves more whole in our capacity to meet the world.
Very interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'll share my process just to see where you would put it.
Yeah.
I investigate, I gather information, and then I empty myself and I watch what the thoughts are creating in my third eye, and I pay attention to what's forming. And when it comes into a state of coherence, something happens inside of me where it feels like all my chakras line up, and that the thought form that is generated when I marry all these pieces together, whatever's not part of that wholeness, that mandala, that I know can't be included because it's not creating coherence. And so I gather, I empty, I watch, and I feel.
Mm-hmm.
I gather all the facts from all the different camps. I empty because they're already inside, and then I watch. And when the coherence emerges, I can feel it inside of myself, and I have a sense of trust and knowing that I'm moving in the right direction. And then I say to my soul, this is what I have taken from this. Is this correct? And if the answer is no, I say, well, then what's missing? And I just keep going till it becomes complete. But usually by the time I get to the point where I can feel my energy line up, I rarely ever get told I'm missing something.
Those characteristics, I couldn't put it into one, and I would hate to give anybody any picture of I think you such and such. But what I can say from the feeling I get and from the language you're using, the spiritist works strongly out of vision, in this kind of inner vision. And they're an investigator, and so they continually refine information. The other word that you used is one of coherence, and coherence literally means light acuity. And so it's the intensity of light, and in its alignment, in a coming togetherness of light is what it means to cohere. David Bohm talks a lot about coherence in dialogue, for example. And I know you resonate with David Bohm.
Very much.
And so again, light deals with vision, which deals with spiritism. That's the sighted component. And the fact that you have remote vision as a capacity, your capacity to see there is also that there's this other part that plays into that feels like phenomenalism. Phenomenalism is capable of bracketing information that doesn't cohere without judging it. And I'm sensing that in the way that you're sharing your process. And so a phenomenalist would be like George Berkeley or like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, an amazing phenomenological philosopher who deals with sexuality and embodiment. I could see you resonating very much with his capacities. He deals with time. And so just listening to you, the phenomenalist deals with the sensate aspect of thinking. The spiritist is right between the feeling and the willing aspect of thinking. So straddling that line, but not in either camp.
Yeah. I think the thing that I've found the most important in my own process is creating the emptiness. Once I gather the information, it's like, okay, the data's in. Now I've got to disconnect from it, because if I don't disconnect from it, there's a risk of bias or programming getting involved. And I think that's where all the years of Tai Chi and meditation have helped me, because I can detach from it, and then I actually see what emerges all by itself. Kind of like planting a seed in the garden that you don't know what the seed is. You don't want to paint the leaves, because then you'll never know what it is. You don't want to, you don't want to bend it or force it to become something else, or you never know what it is. So that for me is the one of the parts that was, I think, I had to achieve, which fortunately my mother, introduced me to Self-Realization Fellowship at the age of 12. And I was quite attracted to the emptiness of meditation as a kid for some reason. But anyhow, I just was curious where you had put that process. That was all.
Well, it's interesting. You're right. I didn't name it because the ability to cultivate silence at a steady state is prerequisite for pure thinking in any of these 12 activities. That's really attained. There are many ways to do it, but certainly a mindful process of allowing the arising of feelings, thoughts, and impulses, and just noticing them until they dissolve and you recognize these are all just objects of consciousness. Thought forms are simply forms like the table or the chair, and that I don't have to identify with any of them. And then behind all that, now I'm ready. And that's why pure thinking is really only the word root for purification. And this is the purification takes place before the thinking takes place. Otherwise, you just got a load full of shit in your mind. You never get anywhere.
Because in the Buddhist conception, pure thinking is thought without judgment. That's one aspect of it.
Yeah, that's the mindful component, is thought without judgment. There's a concentrative aspect, and then there's an absorptive aspect. And the concentrative is good to start with so that you've refined your thinking. And certainly Steiner's approach is that you choose a single thought and you don't deviate from that thought, and be able to stay laser focused on that thought for seconds into minutes. And then you can move into absorption without literally just losing your mind.
Oh, not that again.
Not that again. Right. Yeah. So that's a picture of the different thinking types and our capacity to unite them in ourselves as a single being. And to use each one of those sort of exemplars to recognize, okay, who in the world are teachers of mine? And where do I see them? What stream are they moving out of in general? And I found myself attracted to that. And is it a complementary stream to my own? Because these are all on a wheel. And so they have a complementarity across from them. Each one of them has a polar complement that sometimes could seem antagonistic, but really is a great teacher.
Yeah. Now, just for the listeners, you are going to be taking people through these developmental exercises in actual training, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
I want everybody listening to know that if you join this group, you actually get to do some real Steiner training and go through these exercises, which can be practices you can use for the rest of your life. So it's a great opportunity, because there's not very many people out there that really teach these kinds of Steiner, real Steiner training. It's not very accessible out there in the public. There's only a few people I've ever seen doing anything like that.
Yeah, truthfully, Paul, they don't even do it in Waldorf schools and Waldorf trainings. You go through a whole training, several years, and never work with the thinking types in an active way. And it's amazing to me, because the philosophy of freedom is the philosophy of pure thinking. And it's also the philosophy of spiritual activity or intuition, which is fully realized thought in the moment. This is the basis of Steiner's dissertation. He says it's the only book that will have any significance into the future, which is his freedom philosophy. And so this is deep work, and we're only interested in the practical aspect of it. But the cool thing is that people who come into this group either have a cursory connection to Steiner or none at all, but they're just seekers, and they recognize some part of their soul is saying to them, there's a practical exercise here to work with. And what we do is then we have an accountability partner. So you work with this material and your experiences with it, and everything is exercise based. This is not theoretical. This is on the ground. How does this work in your life, in your relationships, in your work? And then we come back into the group and we share the fruits of those exercises so that we stay very grounded and practical.
Awesome. Let's touch briefly on willingness, and mastering of actions.
Willingness, a basic exercise there would be to do the same thing at the same time every day without setting your iPhone to remind you to do it, so that you have an internal discipline that you just simply say to yourself, well, I'm just going to take this microphone and I'm going to turn it 90 degrees at 12 o'clock every day. And I'm practicing that. And if I can get one of those things, then I add that I'm going to lift up this wonderful iPhone as well as turning this. And I might even change the times. So I'll do one at 1:15 and one at 12 o'clock. And it's building this inner faculty of discipline and timing in order to find the other things in life that need discipline and timing easier to accomplish. So that would be one example for willing.
That's fantastic. And it's interesting, without a long to do, I have several of those things inherent to the way I function. I have to have them, because otherwise it's too easy to get scatterbrained. But David Bohm said something. I don't know if you've ever heard this quote from David Bohm, but it goes hand in hand with what you just said. He said, no man can do deep thinking until he has healthy ritual.
Oh, nice. I hadn't heard that.
Well, that's David Bohm. And
yeah.
As soon as I heard that, I'm like, now I know why I have to have ritual. There has to be a structure to my day. And I've been working with my patients for 41 years. It's crazy how many people are all over the map. Like, they just don't have a healthy basis and ritual. The body needs that. Just, like, one of the things that's messed people up is electronic lighting, because now we extend the day and we're so out of touch with the actual rhythms of nature that we are completely lost with what we're doing to ourselves, because our body is nature.
Yeah, start at candlelight dinners and take candlelight in the evening, and you'll find sleep is just much more magical.
This is a real problem that I see as a therapist, and it's getting worse and worse and worse with all the computer technology and digital illusions, is that the spirit in us really comes from a timeless dimension, but the body in us needs the rhythms of nature to be healthy. And so when people get too aligned with mind, it transgresses the body. So I see minds killing bodies all over the place. And when I mean that literally and metaphorically, I watch people's minds destroy their bodies. And I'm, without naming names, I could put a list together right now for you of famous people that you hear on podcasts all the time talking about health that are very unhealthy. And they don't realize that all they're doing is regurgitating ideas. But they've got so many of these ideas that are actually competing with the reality of their body that they become, what I call a talking head.
Steiner says, any idea that doesn't become an ideal slays a force in you.
It does. Amen. It slays a survival force, right? A necessary
body and
instinct,
soul.
An instinct, a drive. I mean, when you really see the complexity and the beauty of the human body and how it interfaces not only with the nature of the planet, but of the cosmos, that's true religion. You don't need to go to a church. You just ask questions about, how do I have 100 trillion cells dancing in harmony, each made of 100 trillion atoms?
I love that you said that, Paul, because religion literally comes from the Latin ligare, which means ligament, which means to connect or articulate.
Link back.
Yeah.
Religare.
Yeah.
It means the same thing as yoga, which I think is cute.
Yes, to yoke.
To union.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Equanimity.
Equanimity is a lot like the enantiodromia process that you talked about for Jung, where you reconcile opposites until a third space arises, and that third space is a space of freedom. And so, an example of that would be, let's say you and I are talking, and I'm so full of myself and what I want to share that I just can't wait until you're done. And so I feel incredibly impatient. I stop listening to you. I don't value what you have to say. And the gift there is to feel that incredible impatience and to let it be there without changing it. So without pathologizing it or needing to fix, but just saying, what an amazing situation. I'm sitting here choosing impatience. And then I say to the other side, I just say, in addition to feeling and choosing this impatience, I'm also going to choose a feeling of patience. And I'm going to let both of them be present in me in this moment. Incredible patience and incredible impatience, not needing to do anything with them. And the enantiodromic process is that this neutral, unswayed, free space arises, this incredible spaciousness. And into that is the free human being. It's like the Christ between Lucifer and Ahriman. So the equanimity practice, that would be, for example, a process like that. It's always finding the opposite of what you're experiencing. The tricky part is when you're feeling joyful, to choose a feeling of sadness alongside of it. A lot of individuals would rather just feel joyful, but this gets into the same thing of like seeking enlightenment. We're trapping and limiting ourselves if we are lost simply in all of the positive emotions and think that we can avoid then the negative. Now we're into the aversion craving scenario of the Buddhist, where the hungry ghosts just eat us alive all during life. So,
Yeah, that's a bummer.
That's equanimity.
I've had too many patients full of hungry ghosts, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to get people out of that state too, because there's not enough of them left to work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you understand what I mean by
I understand exactly what you mean. It's a little bit like as somebody who works therapeutically, if someone is on a medication, then I have less of them to work with. And I've worked with individuals that are on 12 different medications, and it's simply almost impossible to find the way to the self and find a way through to integration and transformation then. So it's pretty similar.
Yeah. It's these are all things that drive me to want to do what I do, because as many people as I can save from being in that state. And that's one of the things that concerns me deeply about all the, abuse of vaccines and the abuse of electronic technology and the transhumanist movement. I think once people start putting chips in their brain and all that crap, Ahriman's got you, man. That's it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I have a lot of optimism that the self is capable of overcoming absolutely anything. And I have a sense that some people who will choose that implantation of technology, there'll be at least a few who know that they chose that as a destiny in order to consciously overcome it. And so it'll be exciting to see what happens there.
Yeah, I think that's possible for sure, but it takes quite a developed person to do that. And there's not very many of those around. So there's going to be a long wake of broken psyches. For every one that can overcome it, there'll probably be 10,000 that are trapped, which another podcast altogether right there.
Oh, yeah.
Connectedness seems obvious. Contentedness. Okay, well, that one's not so easy to achieve.
Yeah.
The connectedness is there whether you're conscious or not, but to be contented, all you got to do is see if you can get by without your cell phone for a day or an iPad and see how well you do on that one.
Contentedness is really, it's a lot based on some research that came out of the Yale Center for Social and Emotional Intelligence. And for a long time, there was this happiness research, and there was a realization. There was even a happiness quotient in Bhutan, but there was a realization with the research around that happiness. Aristotle sort of started that happiness quotient piece. People are recognizing that contentedness has a bigger bucket to it, and the word actually in English is stronger than in just about any other language, to give the capacity to hold sadness or anxiety or any of these other pieces inside contentedness, whereas happiness has a narrower band of what it allows for affect. And the reason contentedness, each of these are in are in a sequential progression. The reason it comes after equanimity is because after you've practiced having equanimity in this way, then you're able to abide the blows of fate and so-called trauma that come towards you through this practice of contentedness. And so we do exercises to invoke contentedness in the face of our daily situations.
Excellent. Openness?
Openness, again, in the same spirit, starts by recognizing, where am I closed? So it will be a practice of taking anywhere from 2 weeks to a month to being open to anything that in the past, and particularly, we would have said no to. Not anything unhealthy, but in our thinking and our limitations of thinking, if someone brings a very different viewpoint towards something, we would assume a truly scientific attitude. Most of science today is biased and is.
Well, it's technology. It's not science.
Yeah, but it's sadly it's a closed viewpoint based on a scientific so-called community of thinkers. And what this is a truly a Goethean, phenomenological, unbiased view that says, I have had no experience of this whatsoever, zero, but I have 100% openness that this could be true for some individuals at some time, and I will look to see if evidence supports that through my openness.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So tolerance is on the way to openness. Tolerance, and then acceptance, and then even celebration of differences would be what our practices will be around openness.
Great. Our final one is harmonizing and balancing.
Yeah, then we look at the thinking and the willing and the equanimity and the contentedness and the openness, and we take that. I noticed. Actually, it looks like one of these is also called positivity, by the way. And so part of what we do is we recognize that when we're being negative about anything outside of ourselves, we're simply being negative outside of in ourselves, and we're polarizing toward the negative, even as we think we're polarizing positively in our lives. And so our practice is, for several weeks at a time, only to be positive about everything that comes to meet us, and to recognize if we tend to become negative, to immediately correct that with a positive compliment on the other side of that feels authentic and actual. And then the sixth one is this harmonizing balance. And this is taking all of these different attributes and working them all together at the same time, so that we're open, we're positive, we're content, we have equanimity, we're doing our will exercises, and we're consciously using the 12 different kinds of thought as appropriate to any situation.
Well, that'll give you homework for about 27 lifetimes at least.
Yeah. You bet.
But it's all good. Now, have you run these types of groups before, or is this the first time you've put a group through this process?
This will be the first time we've done men and women together, which I'm just super excited about.
Yeah, I think that's a very important idea, especially today.
Yeah.
What are some of the, I mean, obviously you've done this work yourself. I mean, you're very, very deep into all this. What are some of the outcomes that you've seen with people that have gone through this process in the past?
A sense of humor.
Damn it, not that again.
It's that's what I've seen, I think, more than anything else. Although the next thing that comes to me when you say that is a depth of relationship that I've found in these individuals online that just has blown my socks off. But not taking the self so seriously, with sort of the eccentricities and uniquenesses that each of us little snowflakes can manifest. That depth of relationship has also been another one. I find that the folks who come toward this don't have a lot of preconceptions about their spiritual path. They don't have a lot of rigidity around it. And so they have a tremendous amount of openness to something that most of them said at the end of the last 12 weeks that we did. They said they had tried to pick up Steiner and had found it just totally obfuscatory. It's like, how on God's green earth am I going to read something that was originally spoken in Austrian or German, translated, and 100 years ago in Victorian language, and spoken from Michael to boot. How am I supposed to make any sense out of this? But the way that we approach it is very non-dogmatic. That's the one thing to say, is that we're welcoming any experiences from any walks of life. This is not, we're doing this Steiner's way and your way is wrong. This is, all ways are celebrated and welcome, because Steiner clearly said, in 100 years' time, all of my stuff is just going to go down the drain unless it gets revivified, unless you guys remake it. And this culture of people who are coming are the remakers of Steiner's work, and it's really cool.
Well, the thing I think is so important about it is it's practical. It's not like you got a bunch of reading assignments and complex words, and it's really an experience-based program.
Yeah, we give them reading, but they don't have to read a word of it. If they're doing the exercises, it's probably better if they don't do any of the reading, or do it later.
The point I'm making is it's actually an experience-based process.
Yes, which is
it's
a
more
possession.
about what you experience than it is about what you read or memorize.
It's all about that. And here's the funny thing about memory. Steiner clearly said that as long as we're intellects, like heads on popsicle sticks, then anything that we memorize will be dead and from the past. It's no longer relevant. But there's a kind of a living memory that occurs when you're doing experience-based work that's in the present, where everything that you need comes towards you when you need it. And I've actually found that these groups of people, I have done less and less preparation in an outward sense, but much more in an inward sense of paying attention to who they are and what they're bringing. And that's enabled me to be, it's a little terrifying, but be completely tabula rasa when we start our session, and then drop into what feels like it's coming toward me from them. And we've had some profound experiences and discussions and practices grow out of that. So that's the essence of the work.
Well, awesome. Is there a website, or where can people find out more information about this offering?
Well, there'll be an Instagram. Actually, you and Jared.
We're going to do an Instagram.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. And then you can also, you can
Penny
check out
put
my site at
edmundknighton.com.
And myself, I do, spiritual counseling, and as a psychologist, I also do couples and individuals work and so forth. And I'll be starting a group that's very much a self-initiation group as well at the start of the year. So you can see that on edmundknighton.com if you're interested.
Perfect. Okay. Well, what a phenomenal dialogue, Edmund. I totally loved what we went through today.
So much fun.
Yeah, and it's all really important stuff. And we covered a lot of territory. And thank you to you, Edmund, for your ongoing work and just for being you. I really love you.
I love you too. Likewise.
Thank you.
Doing great stuff.
Thank you to the sponsors for all your love and support and your great products and your capacity to channel all our money back into organic and biodynamic farmers and things that are supporting the planet. Thank you to each of you for anything you buy from the sponsors. It takes care of you, helps keep healthy companies healthy, and helps support the podcast. And thanks to all of you guys for joining us. If you've made it this far, then you must be really a true seeker. I have a big open heart for you. I'm grateful that I can share people like Edmund with you. And I will be very excited to share what's coming next on my podcast, which I'm not sure of. But just so you know, we are giving this whole podcast away because I felt this was information that everybody should have. And Edmund will be doing a guest Q&A on this podcast for the podcast members. So if you're not a podcast member, you can join at paulchek.com. It's not expensive at all. You get a lot of great information like this. And even if you want to just join to be in the Q&A with Edmund, you could get a 1-month membership, which I think is less than $8. And feel free to ask Edmund questions because he's capable of answering, as you can hear, a lot of questions. And so I love you guys. Thank you. We got to do this together. Let's wake up, clean up, grow up, and show up, as Ken Wilber says. And I look forward to another amazing podcast with you in a week. Thank you, Edmund.
Thank you, Paul.
Big hug, buddy.
Big hug to you.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Edmund Knighton. As you heard in the podcast, Edmund will be hosting the Be Human program with Jared Picard starting February 2nd, 2025. Registration is now open, and the first 10 people who sign up and mention this podcast will receive a 10% discount, which is a very special consideration for Paul's listeners, as the group size is limited and Jared and Edmund do not typically offer discounts. For more details and to schedule a discovery call with Jared, please visit beherefarm.com/human. That's beherefarm.com/human. For more of the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast, where you can also find details on the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, Wild Pastures, and Organifi, as well as links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channels, and his blog. If you'd like to dive deeper into Spirit Gym with Paul Chek, we invite you to join the podcast membership. When you subscribe, you'll get access to exclusive extended episodes, members-only Q&A opportunities with Paul and podcast guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community, where you could interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. Your support helps keep the show running and allows us to bring you even more and better content. So if you're ready to dive deeper and unlock all these amazing extras, head over to paulchek.com/podcast and become a Spirit Gym podcast member today. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.